For Michelle Broom and her handsome pilot Tom, the sky was the limit.
We got to travel everywhere. We didn't have a care in the world.
Tom was the male version of Michelle in some ways. They had a lot of fun together.
He was just so full of adventure.
But Tom's appetite for adventure took a dark turn.
He was working for the Mexican gangster.
And everything Michelle thought she knew about her dashing husband would crash and burn.
There was no money. It was gone.
He seemed like he was possessed.
There were times he'd be sitting on the couch twitching.
He was a total stranger to me. He was not the man I married.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. They say a girl never forgets her first kiss. For Michelle Broom, the moment came when she was just 14.
When I first met Tom, we were at a church youth group retreat. And we were around the fire, and he just kind of leaned over and planted a big one right in the mouth.
It was the summer of 1982, and 17-year-old Tom Broom was the catch of his small Jacksonville Beach, Florida town.
He was just running with a popular crowd, very athletic. Everybody knew who he was, and he got along with everybody.
But as popular as he was, Tom also had a bit of a dark streak.
He had had a couple of run-ins with police, just doing stupid prankish things, nothing super serious. I was kind of in awe of him because he was very popular, very cute. I was incredibly awkward, big glasses. After the kiss, I barely existed in his world. I would kind of admire him from afar and just go on my nerdy way.
And that was the end of Michelle's teenage crush. Until one day in the fall of 1991.
I had just graduated from college, and Tom was graduating from flight school. We ran into each other at a mutual friend's wedding, and just sparks flew. I remember being really impressed talking to him. I thought, wow, you know, here's somebody who came from a tough situation and they're making it work.
Michelle and Tom quickly became an item.
He and Michelle clicked. I remember thinking that this could be the one.
The glitch was that a couple months from that time, I had already decided that I was moving to LA to pursue my career as a performer. And I told him that after like the third or fourth date, and he immediately said, well, so am I then.
The next spring, Tom and Michelle headed west to pursue their dreams. Michelle had success singing with several local bands, while Tom easily landed a job as a flight instructor. 2 years later, Tom and Michelle knew they were meant to be. And in April 1994, they tied the knot back home in Florida.
I was excited that Michelle had found her guy and that she would be with him forever.
Our wedding was huge. We had a big reception with a killer band, and it was just a giant party. We couldn't get people to leave.
Back in California, the newlyweds quickly embarked on what seemed like an endless honeymoon.
We had various planes of his clients at our disposal, a lot. We went to Fiji, to a private island. We went deep sea fishing in Alaska. It was a really, really fun time in our marriage.
But the honeymoon wouldn't last. Nearly 10 years later, the couple's jet-setting lifestyle would take a twisted turn. By the spring of 2005, Michelle was a mother of 2, and her globe-trotting days were mostly behind her. But Tom was often away on business, so Michelle kept her cell phone handy. And one day, she got a call that would change her life forever.
It was March 3rd, 2005. I was at the car repair shop, and I got a phone call. I recognized the area code as somewhere in Georgia.
At first, Michelle thought the call was from her husband, who was flying to Atlanta that day. But the voice on the other end belonged to a district attorney, and he had shocking news.
He wanted me to know that they had had my family in surveillance for quite some time. I was completely confused. I said, I don't understand. What are you talking about? He said, you need to be extremely careful and you need to do whatever you feel you need to do to disappear. And he hung up.
The instructions were as perplexing as they were terrifying.
I didn't know what to think.
But as more information came in, Michelle soon found herself on the run.
They were telling me that he was working for the Mexican mafia.
It seemed her husband had been playing a very dangerous game.
He was a private pilot, but nobody knew what he was doing half the time.
In the spring of 1996, 10 years before the phone call that would change her life, Michelle Broom and her handsome husband Tom had the world at their feet.
We were very close. We were in love.
But one afternoon, 2 years into her marriage, Michelle came across a disturbing sign that things weren't entirely perfect.
I was going through some papers, and I came across a bill for an attorney, and it was a pretty substantial bill, thousands of dollars. So I called the number on the bill. It turned out to be an attorney that directly deals with people who have gotten DUIs.
Michelle was stunned. Tom had never mentioned a DUI, but he had obviously gotten one a month before.
He came home, and I just held the bill out to him, and I said, what is this? And he was like, oh, I've been meaning to tell you. I got a DUI, and I'm getting out of it. This guy's gonna take care of it for me. I was furious. I was really upset.
Still, it was just one mistake. Michelle decided to let the incident go. For the next 5 years, life carried on as usual. And by the winter of 2001, Michelle and Tom realized they were ready for their next adventure, parenthood.
I'm entering my 30s, the biological clock is ticking. So we decided, to give it a shot. And I got pregnant almost right away. Tom was just over the moon, so happy.
To prepare for the baby, Michelle took a steady job at a record label, and Tom began flying for several high-profile clients. The job meant Tom was often gone, but he was also pulling in 6 figures.
We were both very excited about our lives and careers and the baby coming.
But as Michelle's pregnancy wore on, she quickly realized that Tom had no intention of slowing down.
He was still taking off and taking his surf trips and his golf trips and his skiing trips, in addition to the trips that he was doing for his job.
He would get home from trips, come back, spend an hour, and then off he would go to be with his mates, off to the bar.
Michelle soon noticed that Tom was drinking heavily, and to make matters worse, he seemed to be developing another bad habit.
I overheard him on the phone, and he thought that nobody could hear him, but he was talking to somebody about placing a bet on teams that I'd never heard of before. I asked him about it, and I was like, well, then who were you betting with? Oh, it was, my buddy's bookie. And I'm like, bookie?
Concerned, Michelle asked Tom to cut back on the gambling, and Tom promised he would rein it in. In January 2002, after the birth of their son, he kept his word.
He was just absolutely in love with our son, and I believed at that time that, okay, our lives have changed, and he gets it, and he was home more the first month or two.
But when their son was just 3 months old, things took a turn for the worse.
Tom was in Mexico on a business trip, and he sometimes had trouble getting through the phone connections to check his voicemail from there. So he called me at one point and said, I can't get my voicemail.
Tom asked Michelle to check his messages, and when she did, she heard something completely unexpected.
There was a message from a woman. She was, hey, sweetie, I'm so sorry I missed you. Call me whenever you can, and we'll arrange to see each other. So I called Tom, and I said, who is this woman? And I said her name, and there was dead silence.
Tom refused to discuss the matter over the phone, but the next day he came home and came clean.
He was white when he walked in the door, and he said that he'd only seen her a couple of times, and she was a flight attendant, and they would occasionally connect if they were in the same city. I just looked at him and I thought, oh my, I had no idea you were even capable of this. I would never do this.
Michelle was devastated, but she wasn't ready to throw in the towel.
For better, for worse, I was brought up in that, you're married. You take a vow, and you go through trials, and you make it work.
Michelle insisted on counseling, and for a while, things got better. In 2004, just after their 10th wedding anniversary, Michelle realized she was pregnant again.
My thought was, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but okay, we're having a baby. We're gonna make this work.
But just 1 month into her pregnancy, Michelle's hopes for a renewed marriage were shattered as Tom reverted back to his old ways, and much, much worse.
Tom's drug use was just as bad as his drinking.
He was scary. He seemed like he was possessed.
I just had this overwhelming feeling that he was hiding something.
By the spring of 2004, 10 years into her roller coaster marriage, Michelle Broom could only watch as her husband's self-destructive behavior escalated. Everyone was concerned.
Tom was not in a good place. He was drinking a lot, he was away a lot, he wasn't comfortable, and it was really hard to watch.
That December, Michelle went into labor with her daughter. What should have been a joyful time seemed almost agonizing for Tom.
It was like he was jumping out of his skin being there. He couldn't sit still. He was constantly on the phone. He was pacing, even after the baby was born.
It was disturbing behavior, but Michelle would soon learn that Tom was hiding a much darker secret. On March 3, 2005, 9 weeks after the birth of their daughter, Tom was flying to Atlanta on business. Michelle was at the mechanics when she got an alarming call from a district attorney in Georgia.
He said, your family's been under surveillance for quite some time now. I know that you know nothing. And he said, your husband has been arrested. We have him in custody. He was found with a large amount of cocaine on his airplane.
The DA couldn't give Michelle any more details over the phone, but his final words were chilling.
And he said, you and the kids are in danger. You need to disappear.
Frantic and confused, Michelle raced to pick up her children. She then made a beeline for the bank. And that's when she got another horrible surprise.
I went to try and withdraw money, and it was gone. There was no money in there. It just didn't make sense. I called my sister, Renee. She was working, and I just said, drop everything.
When I got to Michelle, she looked like she was in a complete fog. Everyone's main concern was getting her to a place where nobody could find her. We went to my younger sister's house because she lived in a gated community.
2 hours after she arrived at her sister's, Michelle got a phone call from Tom.
He was at the county jail, and I'm trying to ask questions. What happened? Who were you flying with? Who was the person that called me? Why were we under surveillance?
Tom refused to get into it over the phone.
He kept saying, I can't talk too much because they're listening. Get me home so that we can sort this out. Then I'll tell you everything.
Tom's bail had been set at $250,000. Michelle was forced to borrow the money from friends. 3 weeks later, Tom Broom was back in California.
A friend of ours picked him up at the airport and brought him over to my sister's apartment. And he walked in the door. He had this look on his face, like a sheepish look on his face, like, I got caught. I'm really dreading having to tell you this. He said there were drugs. The gambling was just outrageous. And he said that the money was gone. He had gambled it all away.
Desperate to replace the couple's squandered savings, Tom began taking flights for someone he had met in LA.
This guy had offered him cash to fly these flights from Los Angeles to Atlanta and back. No passengers on the plane, just suitcases, no questions asked. And every time he made one of these flights, he would make a giant chunk of cash, like tens of thousands of dollars.
During his last flight, Tom had been stopped by customs.
They started questioning him. He gave them all the paperwork on the plane and his license and everything, like it was just a routine check. And they said, is it okay if we search your plane? They asked him to open a certain compartment on the plane. He said he didn't have the keys to it. They brought out dogs, and the dogs immediately went to that section of the plane and started going crazy.
I think it was like 4 suitcases filled with pure cocaine. I mean, it's not even cut with anything.
He was caught with 65 kilos, which has a street value of a couple $1 million.
Tom insisted he didn't know what was in the suitcases. But he did have one more horrible admission to make. The man he was flying for was also a member of the notorious and dangerous Mexican mafia.
Obviously, I understood at that point why our lives were in danger.
In March 2005, Michelle Broom's entire world had been turned upside down. Her husband Tom stood accused of drug trafficking and was on house arrest. His claims of innocence were starting to ring hollow.
I said, you know, if somebody's offering you that much cash to fly a plane with no people on it, with locked suitcases, something's going on.
The stress with Michelle was tangible. She tried to hold it together, but it was really, really hard.
The couple now needed to hire an expensive defense team. But Tom's irresponsible behavior had left them penniless.
We were looking at financial ruin, basically.
On the advice of an attorney, Michelle started divorce proceedings.
It was unclear yet whether or not the government was going to come in and seize any of our assets. I was told that if I filed for divorce, if we had any money left over, I could possibly allocate it as child support.
It was a heartbreaking scene, but it was just the beginning. When the couple met with Tom's defense team that April, Michelle realized that her husband had no chance.
They could link him to dozens of these flights, and it had been going on for quite some time, over a year at least. They had conversations recorded. They had instances where he was flying and would change the tail number of the plane mid-route, or change the destination of the plane mid-route, which is a common thing that drug runners do.
Even worse, Tom had also hand-delivered the suitcases to their recipient in Georgia.
He knew the guy's name that he was meeting with. He had a regular meeting point with him. I was blown away. At one point, I looked up and I had this feeling looking at him like, I don't even know who you are.
In July of 2005, after more than 10 years of marriage, Michelle and Tom's divorce was finalized. Meanwhile, Tom, still on house arrest, was falling apart.
It's like the demons that were inside of him just took over. Everything just came back to the surface. All of the addictions, all of the anger, all of the anxiety, the need to escape from it all.
He would go on these drinking rampages and have drugs delivered to the house. He would go on these binges, take pills. I mean, there were times he'd be sitting on the couch twitching. Michelle came to that point and she realized she had to revoke bail on Tom. His behavior was so erratic.
Just before Thanksgiving 2005, Tom Broom went back to jail. That winter, he pled guilty to possession of narcotics with an intent to distribute. There was no trial, and Tom was granted leniency for cooperating with the investigation. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison.
It was heartbreaking on many different levels, both watching him as a human being, somebody I care about, watching a marriage completely disappear.
Michelle has traveled a long, hard road since that first kiss almost 30 years ago. Today, she's a single parent. And while she continues to struggle financially, she has an unwavering support system in her family.
The bond that I have and that my kids have now with their grandparents and my sisters and my brother-in-laws is incredible. I could not have made it through this with my sanity somewhat intact without them.
And now, with strength and courage, Michelle is ready to face her next hurdle, Tom's release.
I've talked to him at length about what's going to happen when he gets out. I want him to be a part of the kids' lives, but I will definitely be in control of the situation as far as monitoring how healthy he is. I have forgiven Tom. It's a waste of energy not to. but I haven't forgotten.
When Cynthia Castile met Chef Wayne Chin on an Alaskan cruise, she thought her ship had finally come in.
He was gregarious, he was fun, he was sensitive.
Mom was head over heels in love.
But life with Wayne was hardly the ride she expected.
There was a sheriff standing there, and he said, "Do you know Wayne Chin?"
Wayne's checkered past would soon catch up with him and put their marriage on a collision course with disaster.
The lies he's telling aren't petty lies. These are serious, serious lies.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Cynthia Castile never planned for heartbreak. She always believed in happily ever after.
I'm probably one of the world's best optimists. I love being a wife, so I just figured I would always be married for the rest of my life.
But after a devastating divorce, Cynthia's heart seemed forever on the mend.
Cynthia's first marriage broke up because her husband had an affair with one of Cynthia's friends.
It was very devastating to have that come to an end and then feel like a failure. Why couldn't I make it work?
7 years had done little to repair the damage, so in April of 1998, 45-year-old Cynthia left her small town in Oregon to embark on a new adventure.
I was speaking with a close girlfriend, and she said to me, "Well, Cynthia, what about, like a job on a cruise ship?"
Cynthia found a customer relations position on an Alaskan cruise line. Soon, she was surrounded by new sights, new cities, and a new man, the ship's chef, Wayne Yi Chin. From the moment they met, Wayne came on strong.
I was trying to kind of make a bouquet out of the flowers that was there, and Wayne came by, and he goes, "Oh," he said, "those are pretty. Are those yours?" I said, "No, no one ever sends me flowers." And when I went down to my cabin that afternoon to change my clothes, there was a bouquet of flowers with a card from him. The next day we actually talked, and he told me he had every intentions of making me his wife. I'm looking at him thinking, okay, whatever.
Wayne told Cynthia he had learned to cook in the Navy, where he still served as a reserve officer.
That made me feel good because he is patriotic. He was doing something to help his fellow man.
Wayne seemed perfect, and by now, Cynthia was eager to open her heart again.
She called and said, "I've met somebody. We just fell in love."
I hadn't had a man pay attention to me in over, 7 years, and he was wonderful. He was gregarious, he was sensitive, he was fun.
And Wayne was open about his own painful past.
Wayne had been through a very horrendous divorce. He had 3 children, and he had found her in bed with another man, and he had been terribly hurt. I could identify with that because I had been in that position too.
But that wouldn't stop Wayne from trying again. In September of 1999, after 1 month together at sea, he proposed to Cynthia.
Wayne said, "Come in the cooler for a minute." Then he dropped an emerald and diamond ring in my hand and said, "This is my promise that I'll be faithful to you for the rest of your life." And I was so excited to be able to say, I'm going to be somebody's wife again.
But the happy glow of their new engagement didn't last long. Soon after the ship docked in San Francisco, Wayne told Cynthia he had received some devastating news. His 2 college-age children had died in a car crash.
They were going to surprise their dad, and that they had been killed in this horrible accident. I remember holding him and him crying, my babies are gone."
To make matters worse, Wayne said his ex-wife hadn't even bothered to call. He said he got the news from his daughter's friend and had already missed the funerals.
I couldn't believe that somebody would be so cruel as to do this. It was just heart-wrenching.
Despite the tragedy, Wayne was still eager to marry Cynthia right away.
He said people's lives cross for a reason, and that I was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that he wanted me with him for the rest of his life.
2 weeks later, Cynthia and Wayne tied the knot in a small ceremony in Cynthia's hometown of Eagle Creek, Oregon.
We catered our own wedding reception. My mom did the cake, and I was real excited that I'm going to have that special connection with that person.
She was absolutely beautiful. She had a glow because she was happy.
The newlyweds quickly settled into life back on land, and in January of 2000, they found new jobs together as managers at a motel on the Oregon coast.
Our apartment was behind the reception area. I was supposed to do the front counter. He was supposed to do the maintenance and the yards and things like that.
But the newlywed bliss wouldn't last long. On Valentine's Day, just 4 months after their wedding, the couple got a surprise visit from an unwelcome guest.
A buzzer in our apartment rang, and there was a Lincoln County sheriff standing there. And I said, well, can I help you? And he said, do you know Wayne Chin? And he walked out, and so the sheriff told him he had a warrant for his arrest. It was just like somebody had just kicked me in the gut.
Cynthia would soon find out that not only was her new husband a wanted man, he was keeping secrets that would jeopardize their jobs and their marriage.
Wayne Chin is a mastermind of being able to manipulate women.
For Cynthia Castile, Valentine's Day of 2000 was memorable for all the wrong reasons. Her husband, Wayne Chin, had just been arrested, right in the lobby of the Oregon motel they managed.
Wayne said, there's got to be a mistake. He told me that our housekeeper and her boyfriend had used a debit card of one of the guests and had signed his name to the card.
But after arresting him for theft, police discovered that this was far from his first offense.
They ran his name and discovered that he had a warrant out for his arrest from Lewis County, Washington.
In Washington, Wayne was convicted of a forgery charge, and the court required him to do a certain number of things. Well, apparently he didn't do those things, and he faced a bail jumping charge.
But Wayne told Cynthia there was a logical explanation, claiming a vindictive ex-girlfriend had falsely accused him of stealing her financial information.
He told me that he had purchased a car with his previous girlfriend, and then she tried to back out of the deal. But he told me he had taken care of it. He didn't understand why this was happening.
He kept saying, I didn't do it, I didn't do anything wrong. But I kept telling Mom, then why has he been arrested?
But Cynthia was confident in her man.
Cynthia loved him. He loved her. And so she ended up writing checks for $14,000 to defend the man she loves from this criminal charge.
5 weeks later, Wayne was free, and married life was back on track. In April of 2001, the couple found new jobs together once again, this time managing a popular seafood restaurant in a nearby town.
We set up a menu where the ocean meets the plate was our little catchphrase. And, and here was a dream come true for both of us.
But the dream had one flaw. Wayne often had to leave home for Naval Reserve training.
Cynthia would tell me that he was spending the weekend up in Washington. And I'm going, there's no water up there. Why is he going to Central Washington as the Naval Reserve?
He started supposedly getting emails from a commander in the Navy. And she showed them to me. I said, wait a minute. If it's an official military email, it's not going to come from a Yahoo account. It's going to come from a military account. Something's not right.
But once again, Cynthia gave Wayne the benefit of the doubt, until that June, when the law paid them another visit.
We were just getting ready to close for the evening, and a county sheriff shows up. And it's like, oh my gosh, now they're going to haul Wayne off again. The sheriff takes Wayne, and I sit down on the bench behind the reception area at the restaurant and cry.
Wayne had skipped yet another court date for his forgery charge. This time, he would spend 8 months in a Washington state prison.
I was very, very unhappy. But all married couples do go through good times, bad times.
Anytime that she went up to visit him, she just did not sound like her normal self. You could hear the sadness in her voice after that.
When Wayne was released from prison in August of 2002, Cynthia was there to pick him up. She was determined to put the past behind them. She was about to turn 50, and Wayne wanted to throw her a party.
He said, yeah, let's, plan the party. I will find a place to have it at. I'll pay for it. I'll make sure she gets there.
But the night before the celebration, Wayne got a disappointing call.
The phone rang, and he goes, well, that was my parole officer from Lewis County, and they're coming to do an in-home visit tomorrow. And I said, Wayne, my party's tomorrow. What am I supposed to do? He goes, oh, just go. It'll be fine. He goes, you just go in the hotel, and they have it all set up for you.
The next day, Cynthia drove alone to her party, 2 hours away. But what greeted her there was a terrible surprise, one that would destroy her faith in her husband forever.
He lied to the entire family. It was like a punch in the gut for all of us.
So I went back out and I sat in the car and I cried. And I cried and I cried and I cried.
It was January 13th, 2003, Cynthia Castile's 50th birthday celebration. Her husband Wayne had planned a fancy party, even though a parole visit meant he couldn't be there.
I traveled the 2.5 hours up from the coast to the hotel restaurant where the party's supposed to be, and I go into the hostess desk, tell them who I am and what's supposed to be there, and there's no reservations.
They said, we have no record of a party being booked for today. There's been no payment made. We don't know who you're talking about.
So I went back out and I sat in the car and I cried. And I cried and I cried and I cried.
When Cynthia returned home, Wayne tried to persuade her the hotel made a mistake. But she wasn't buying it. Her blind faith in Wayne had been shattered.
So the next day when he went to work, I got the number of his parole officer for Lewis County and called her and said, just wanted to know, do you do out-of-state in-home visits? And she says, no.
That evening, Cynthia confronted her husband.
I said, so Wayne, how was that visit yesterday? Everything go okay? He said, it went great. And I said, well, that's funny. I talked to her today, and they don't do out-of-state in-home visits. So backpedaling really fast, he told me, well, it was one of her other associates. And so I just finally said, whatever.
I think it was the final straw. I think that started her really reconsidering things, really questioning everything even more.
But despite her growing doubts, Cynthia couldn't face the prospect of another divorce. So she swallowed her pride and gave Wayne one last chance.
It's because you believe so strongly in this person. It overshadows that unbelief. And that's what was happening. I mean, this man told me he loved me for the rest of my life.
2 months later, in March of 2003, Wayne found a new job opportunity at a restaurant in Colorado, over 1,000 miles away.
I told Wayne that there was no sense in me quitting my job. I might as well stay till June, and then I would come and join him.
For months, the couple talked by phone, planning their future together in the Rockies. Until one day in late August, when Cynthia got a strange call from her husband.
He goes, have you checked your email? And I go, well, why? He goes, you just need to check your email.
Cynthia hung up, logged on, and sure enough, there was an email from Wayne, asking for a divorce.
I broke down and I cried. All my dreams were now all gone. I was nobody's wife again.
But Cynthia's heartbreak was just beginning. In early January 2004, she phoned Wayne at work to tell him the divorce papers were ready.
The owner of the place came on the phone, and she says, well, he doesn't work here anymore. I fired him in December. But he still is here in Estes Park with his wife, Kim. And I said, well, I'm his wife. She says, well, he's got 2 of them, doesn't he?
Cynthia had lived with Wayne's petty crimes and even forgiven his lies. But to her, the bigamy was the ultimate betrayal. Little did she know, it was just the tip of the iceberg. As Cynthia poured through Wayne's personal documents, she soon discovered that the man she'd opened her heart to was little more than a common crook.
Wayne Chin has a criminal record in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. He went to work at a lumber mill as a security guard. He was accused of burning down the lumber mill, and we know he actually went to prison for that.
And Wayne wasn't a naval officer or in the reserves. He had been discharged from the Navy decades earlier.
So the whole time that Wayne was doing the Naval Reserves was all bogus. I was completely dumbfounded that somebody could figure this all out and not think that they would get caught.
It seemed that everything Cynthia had loved about Wayne was a lie, but she was about to get even.
I thought there might be 2 women, 3 women, but there's 4, there's 5, there's 6, there's 7.
He didn't have any remorse, he don't care. And I had had enough.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In January of 2004, Cynthia Castile was stunned to discover that her husband Wayne Chin was a bigamist, living a double life with another wife in Colorado. But that was far from all.
Here I was caught up in this web of all this mystery, all these unanswered questions.
Cynthia soon learned that Wayne had a long history of manipulating and marrying women.
You start looking at court documents and you realize there isn't 2, there isn't 3, there's 4, there's 5, there's 6, there's 7, and that is just the women he's married.
Determined to unravel Wayne's lies once and for all, Cynthia reached out to the women in his past.
I sat down and I wrote a letter listing all of these women's email address and put all the details of the bigamy, and I contacted the ex-wife, and we played a lot of I'll tell you if you tell me.
It soon became clear how Wayne won so many hearts.
Wayne Chin is a mastermind of being able to manipulate women. One of the things he says is that he's in the Navy, and that gives him dignity and cachet, and it's one of the things that they're drawn to, a man in uniform. He comes in at the right time, he woos them, he tells them the things that they want to hear, especially in that time in their lives where they feel vulnerable, and then he marries them, and once he marries them, he has access to their finances, just like any husband or wife does.
And when things began to get complicated, it seemed that Wayne had a clever exit plan.
One of his big cons with one of his fiancées is that he got called up to Iraq. So he goes to Iraq, and while he's in Iraq, he's calling her in the middle of the night when she's asleep because Iraq is on a different time zone.
Hey, you. Hold on just a minute. Roger that, Enterprise 6-7. Message confirmed. Secondary is on its way to you as I speak. Anyway, just calling you.
And she's back in this country trying to, keep him supported by writing checks to pay his bills. Meanwhile, he's off somewhere else, married to another woman.
So you let this pathological liar into your life that messes up everything, and there's no law against lying. So if there's no law against lying, then how do we stop this person?
I investigate a lot of crooks, but usually it has to do with something that's an object, like a car or credit cards. But this case is different because he's using love. Love is the thing that he uses to take advantage of people.
And there was one lie that was the most disturbing of all. Wayne's 2 children were very much alive.
That is one of the key parts of his con. By telling these women that his 2 children have died in a car wreck, he's opening himself up. And they want to give him their shoulder to cry on. And it's one of the things that bonds them the most to him, that he's lived through this tragedy.
I was just literally floored. Why would anybody use their children like that to further their own cause? Why would anybody do that?
It was the final straw for Cynthia. She marched down to the sheriff's office and filed bigamy charges against Wayne.
I think Cynthia had come to realize that he really was a liar, a cheat, and a scumbag. And I think it was probably more of a relief to her.
In July 2004, Wayne Yi Chin was found guilty of bigamy. He spent 10 days in jail and paid a $500 fine, the maximum penalty that Oregon law allowed. This time, Cynthia didn't pay his legal fees.
When I walked out of the room, then I just completely fell all apart. It was time to let it all go, just to melt away and then be strong again.
Their divorce became official on October 26, 2004.
I was very relieved that he was gone, that he wasn't going to be a part of my life anymore. But I wasn't anybody's wife anymore. That's the heartache that I have.
Today, Cynthia is no longer caring for her man, but she hasn't stopped caring for others.
I live with my mom here. Both my girls live within 6 miles, and my grandchildren. I'm head of dining services at an assisted living center and enjoy my job very much. Life is just good.
Though Cynthia is dating, she's unsure that she will ever marry again.
It still kind of haunts her. She was very vulnerable to him. I do hope that one day she will meet the man of her dreams.
It's like, well, here's my background. Feel free to check it, because you better believe I'm going to check yours. I'm not going to put myself in that position again.
The first warning came from a stranger, not a police siren, not a knock at the door, not a late-night news report, just a phone call in the middle of an ordinary afternoon that shattered a life so completely it would never fit back together again. Michelle Broom stood inside a car repair shop in Southern California, distracted by routine errands and the demands of raising 2 young children. Her infant daughter was only weeks old. Her toddler son was waiting to be picked up. Outside, traffic moved through the bright March sunlight. Inside, nothing seemed unusual until her cell phone rang. The number displayed an unfamiliar area code from Georgia. She assumed it might be Tom. He was flying that day, as he often did. Flying was his life. It was the thing that had always defined him, the thing that made him seem fearless, charming, capable of going anywhere. She answered, expecting to hear her husband's voice. Instead, a man introduced himself as a district attorney. Before the conversation ended, Michelle would learn that her family had been under surveillance, that her husband had been arrested, that cocaine had been found on his airplane, and that she needed to disappear immediately if she wanted to keep herself and her children safe. In that instant, the life she believed she was living vanished. The marriage she thought she understood evaporated. The man she had loved for nearly 15 years suddenly became a stranger. Yet the most terrifying part was not what she knew. It was what she didn't know. Because as shocking as that phone call was, it was merely the final piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself in the shadows for years. To outsiders, Tom and Michelle Broom seemed like the kind of couple who had somehow found a way to beat the odds. They looked like the people featured in travel magazines and airline advertisements. Attractive, adventurous, successful, the kind of pair who made ordinary lives feel small by comparison. Friends saw them jetting across oceans, visiting tropical islands, fishing in Alaska, exploring places most people only dreamed of seeing. Tom was a pilot with movie star looks and endless confidence. Michelle was talented, ambitious, and warm. Together they appeared unstoppable. Their story seemed built on romance and possibility. But appearances can be deceptive. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets hide behind the brightest smiles. Sometimes a marriage can function like a stage set in a theater. From the audience, everything appears solid and beautiful. Yet behind the painted walls, entire sections are hollow. Long before federal agents began tracking aircraft movements and monitoring suspicious conversations, before drug-sniffing dogs circle an airplane on a Georgia runway, before attorneys, prison sentences, and divorce papers entered the picture, there was a teenage girl sitting around a church campfire. There was a handsome boy with an easy grin and a reputation that attracted attention wherever he went. There was a first kiss. There was innocence. There was hope. Looking back years later, Michelle would replay those memories repeatedly, searching for clues she had missed, searching for warnings hidden in plain sight, searching for the moment when the future might have changed if only she had seen what was coming. The problem with hindsight is that it always arrives too late. The Tom Broom Michelle first knew seemed larger than life. He was athletic, popular, charismatic. The kind of young man who naturally became the center of any room he entered. He moved through life with a confidence that fascinated people. Friends admired him. Women noticed him. He carried himself like someone destined for bigger things. Yet beneath the charm, there were cracks few people paid attention to. Small brushes with trouble, minor run-ins with police, reckless decisions dismissed as youthful mistakes. Nothing serious enough to define him. Nothing alarming enough to alter the way people viewed him. At least not then. Years later, those small incidents would look different, because when investigators eventually examined Tom's life, they discovered a pattern, not a single catastrophic decision, but a series of choices stretching back across decades. Risks, thrill-seeking, impulses left unchecked, a constant hunger for excitement. The appetite for adventure that once made him seem fascinating would eventually become the very thing that destroyed him. But nobody knew that story yet. Not Michelle, not their families, not even Tom himself. For years, life unfolded like a dream. Careers advanced. Opportunities multiplied. The couple married. Children arrived. From the outside, everything looked successful, yet somewhere beneath the surface, another story was developing. A darker story. One built on gambling debts, addiction, deception, and desperation. And desperation is often where true crime begins. Not with violence, not with evil masterminds, but with a series of compromises. One rationalization after another, one secret after another, one line crossed, then another, until eventually there is no path back. The details will emerge slowly after Tom's arrest. First came the revelation that their savings had disappeared, then the gambling losses, then the drug use, then the shocking realization that Tom had spent years living a double life. Every answer uncovered a deeper question. Every confession exposed another lie. Michelle found herself standing in the wreckage of a marriage, wondering whether the man she loved had ever truly existed at all. What happens when the person sleeping beside you becomes unrecognizable? What happens when you discover that the father of your children has been moving through a criminal world you never knew existed? What happens when federal authorities know more about your husband than you do? Those questions haunted Michelle from the moment she received that call. The district attorney's warning wasn't dramatic for effect. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't paranoia. Authorities believed the danger was real. The organization connected to Tom's activities was not a group of reckless amateurs. It was connected to powerful criminal networks operating across international borders. Networks built on fear, money, and violence. People who did not appreciate loose ends. Suddenly, Michelle found herself looking over her shoulder everywhere she went. Every unfamiliar vehicle became suspicious. Every stranger became a potential threat. She gathered her children and disappeared into protection of family members. Safe neighborhoods and locked gates became necessities rather than comforts. Sleep became difficult. Trust became impossible. Meanwhile, the man at the center of everything sat in jail, waiting for a future that was rapidly collapsing around him. What made the story especially tragic was that Tom wasn't some hardened criminal raised inside a life of organized crime. He wasn't a cartel enforcer. He wasn't a lifelong trafficker. He was a suburban father, a husband, a licensed pilot, someone who once seemed destined for success. And yet somewhere along the way, he drifted toward a world that consumed him, a world of gambling, a world of addiction, a world where fast money solved immediate problems while creating permanent consequences. By the time authorities caught him, investigators believed he had been involved in suspicious flights for more than a year. Flights carrying locked suitcases, flights paying enormous sums of cash, flights that should have raised questions, flights that any experienced pilot would likely recognize as dangerous. The evidence painted a devastating picture. Tail numbers changed mid-route. Destinations altered unexpectedly. Meetings arranged with specific contacts. Patterns repeated again and again. The image of the innocent pilot transporting luggage without asking questions became increasingly difficult to believe, and Michelle was forced to confront a painful possibility. Perhaps the man she married had not simply made a terrible mistake. Perhaps he had been lying for years. As this story unfolds, we will follow the path that led from a teenage romance to a federal prison sentence. We will examine the choices, warnings, betrayals, and turning points that transformed a seemingly perfect life into a cautionary tale of addiction and deception. We will explore how gambling losses spiraled into criminal behavior, how a family became collateral damage in a dangerous underworld, and how one woman fought to protect her children while everything around her collapsed. Because this is not simply a story about drug trafficking. It is not merely a story about crime. It is a story about trust, about the terrifying realization that sometimes the greatest threat does not come from a stranger in the darkness. Sometimes it comes from a person you believe you know best. And on a warm afternoon in March 2005, standing inside a California repair shop with cell phone pressed against her ear, Michelle Broom learned exactly how frightening that realization could be. The nightmare had already begun. She just didn't know how far back it started. The story begins far from federal courtrooms, prison cells, and drug investigations. It begins in a place that seemed almost untouched by darkness, a place where the future stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and where mistakes still felt temporary. In the early 1980s, Jacksonville Beach, Florida, was the kind of town where teenagers spent their afternoons under bright coastal skies, and their evenings gathered around bonfires, football games, and church events. Salt hung in the air. Palm trees swayed along quiet streets. The Atlantic Ocean rolled steadily onto the shoreline, as if nothing in the world could ever truly go wrong. For young people growing up there, life seemed filled with possibilities. Dreams felt achievable. Consequences felt distant. It was in this environment that two teenagers first crossed paths. Michelle was 14 years old. By her own description, she was awkward, shy, and uncertain of herself. She wasn't the girl who commanded attention when she entered a room. She wasn't surrounded by admirers. While other teenagers seemed to move confidently through social circles, Michelle often felt like an observer standing on the edge of the crowd. She wore large glasses and carried the insecurities common to many young teenagers. The future version of herself, the confident woman who would eventually move across the country chasing a music career, was still years away. Tom Broom, on the other hand, seemed to exist in an entirely different universe. At 17, he was already one of those people who naturally attracted attention. He was athletic, handsome, and outgoing, the type of young man who seemed comfortable in every situation. Teachers knew him, coaches liked him, friends gravitated toward him. In a relatively small community like Jacksonville Beach, his reputation preceded him wherever he went. He had the easy confidence that many teenagers spend years trying to develop. To someone like Michelle, he seemed almost larger than life. Their first memorable interaction occurred during a church youth retreat. The setting could hardly have appeared more innocent. A group of teenagers gathered around a fire, the glow of flames flickering against faces, laughter drifting into the night air, conversations unfolding beneath a sky crowded with stars. For Michelle, it was simply another evening among friends and acquaintances. Then Tom leaned toward her and kissed her. For a 14-year-old girl, the moment felt enormous. Years later, she would still remember it clearly. The surprise, the excitement, the disbelief. But as meaningful as the moment was for her, it did not lead to a teenage romance. Tom remained popular and busy with his own life. Michelle continued quietly admiring him from a distance. Their paths separated. Time moved forward. The story could have ended there. Many first crushes do. Many teenage encounters become nothing more than memories. But fate has a strange way of reconnecting people when they least expect it. Throughout the 1980s, both Michelle and Tom followed different roads into adulthood. They matured, changed, and accumulated experiences that would shape who they became. Michelle focused on education and eventually graduated from college. She developed ambitions beyond her hometown and dreamed about building a life filled with creativity and opportunity. Music became an important part of her world. She wanted more than a conventional path. She wanted adventure. Tom pursued aviation. Flying suited him perfectly. Pilots occupy a unique place in the imagination. They represent freedom, movement, possibility. They rise above ordinary limitations. For someone with Tom's personality, the profession seemed almost inevitable. He loved excitement. He loved challenges. He loved feeling unrestricted. Flight school offered all those things. Yet even during those early years, subtle warning signs appeared. Friends described Tom as fun-loving and adventurous, but there were also stories of youthful recklessness, minor encounters with law enforcement, pranks that push boundaries, risk-taking behavior that occasionally crossed lines. Nothing serious enough to derail his future. Nothing that would have caused alarm among those who cared about him. Still, looking back from the perspective of everything that happened later, those details feel significant because character is often revealed in small moments long before major decisions occur. Some people are naturally cautious. Others constantly seek stimulation. They crave excitement. They become restless with routine. The line separating adventure from recklessness can be surprisingly thin. In the fall of 1991, nearly a decade after that first kiss around a campfire, Michelle and Tom unexpectedly met again. The setting this time was a mutual friend's wedding. Both had changed. Michelle was no longer the awkward teenager with oversized glasses. She had completed college and was stepping confidently into adulthood. Tom had become a trained pilot, carrying himself with the same charisma that had always attracted people. When they saw each other again, something clicked immediately. The attraction that had existed years earlier suddenly found room to grow. Conversation came naturally. Laughter came easily. The connection felt genuine. What might have remained a forgotten memory transformed into the beginning of a serious relationship. For Michelle, one aspect of Tom's story proved especially appealing. He had not come from perfect circumstances. He had faced challenges. He had experienced obstacles. Yet he seemed determined to build something meaningful for himself. That resilience impressed her. She saw ambition. She saw confidence. She saw a man creating a future. Most importantly, she saw a possibility. Their relationship accelerated quickly. The chemistry was undeniable. Friends noticed it. Family members noticed it. Even Tom seemed convinced that something significant was happening between them. There was only one complication. Michelle had already decided she was leaving Florida. Los Angeles called to her. The city represented opportunity, music, creativity, and reinvention. She wanted to pursue a career as a performer. The decision had already been made before the relationship became serious. Many couples might have ended things there. Long-distance relationships are difficult. Cross-country moves create uncertainty. But Tom's response surprised her. If she was going to Los Angeles, he would go too. Just like that. No hesitation. No complicated negotiation. No months of deliberation. The decision reflected the qualities that made Tom both attractive and dangerous throughout his life. He was spontaneous, bold, fearless. When he wanted something, he pursued it immediately. The following spring, they headed west together. California in the early 1990s felt like a place where dreams could still be invented from scratch. Endless sunshine, expanding industries, creative energy, reinvention. For two young people eager to build exciting lives, Los Angeles offered exactly the kind of environment they wanted. And initially, everything seemed to work. Michelle found opportunities, singing with local bands. Tom quickly established himself as a flight instructor. Money was coming in. Careers were developing. Their future appeared bright. Those early California years would later become some of Michelle's most cherished memories because they represented a version of life untouched by betrayal. They were partners, teammates, explorers. They built dreams together. After 2 years in California, the next step felt obvious: marriage. In April 1994, they returned to Florida and celebrated a wedding that reflected the joy surrounding their relationship. Family and friends gathered to witness what appeared to be the union of two people perfectly matched for one another. The reception was large, energetic, and memorable. Music filled the room. Guests laughed, danced, and lingered long after the formal celebration should have ended. Nobody wanted the night to end. Nobody imagined the future waiting ahead. At that moment, Michelle believed she had found her life partner, the person she would grow old beside, the father of her future children, the man who would stand with her through every challenge. Back in California, married life initially resembled an extended honeymoon. Tom's aviation career expanded rapidly. His clients often possess extraordinary resources, including access to private aircraft. The opportunities seemed endless. One trip led to another. The couple traveled to places many people never experience in a lifetime. Private islands in Fiji, fishing adventures in Alaska, luxury destinations scattered across the globe. Every journey reinforced the image of a perfect life unfolding exactly as planned. Photographs captured smiles. Friends envied their experiences. The future seemed limitless. For nearly a decade, the marriage projected success. But beneath the photographs and vacation memories, something less visible was developing. Not all at once, not dramatically, slowly, almost invisibly, like a crack forming beneath the foundation of a house. At first, nobody noticed. Why would they? The couple looked happy. Tom's career was thriving. Michelle's dreams were progressing. They had built a life many people admired. Yet hidden beneath the excitement was an important truth about Tom's personality. He rarely slowed down. He constantly searched for the next experience, the next thrill, the next destination, the next challenge. For some people, ambition creates success. For others, it creates restlessness. And restlessness can become dangerous when satisfaction always feels temporary. The skies offered Tom freedom. Flying offered independence. Adventure offered escape. But eventually, those same desires would lead him somewhere far darker than either he or Michelle could imagine. Years before cocaine-filled suitcases appeared on an airplane. Years before gambling debts consumed family finances. Years before addiction transformed him into someone even his wife barely recognized. The seeds were already present, invisible, unnoticed, waiting. From the outside, Tom and Michelle Broom represented an American success story. A teenage crush reunited years later. Two ambitious young adults pursuing their dreams together. A marriage filled with travel, excitement, and promise. Their world seemed built on love, opportunity, and shared adventure. But true crime stories rarely begin with the crime itself. They begin with ordinary lives, ordinary choices, ordinary moments. And somewhere inside those moments, the future quietly starts taking shape. As the years passed and the honeymoon phase slowly gave way to the realities of adulthood, the first small fractures would begin to appear. At first, they seemed insignificant, easy to forgive, easy to explain away. But those cracks would eventually widen into something neither Michelle nor anyone else could stop. The beautiful life they had spent years building was already drifting toward a collision course with deception, addiction, and disaster. Neither of them knew it yet, but the perfect sky above them was beginning to darken. If this story were only about a pilot who became involved with drug traffickers, it would be tragic enough. But at its core, this is also the story of a woman whose life became entangled with secrets she never chose and dangers she never saw coming. To understand the devastation that followed, we first need to understand Michelle Broom, not as the wife of a criminal defendant, not as a single mother struggling to rebuild her life, but as the person she was before everything fell apart. Long before federal agents were tracking airplanes and prosecutors were preparing criminal cases, Michelle was simply someone who believed deeply in love, loyalty, and commitment. Those values would ultimately become both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability. Friends often describe Michelle as intelligent, compassionate, and determined. Unlike people who drift through life waiting for opportunities to appear, she actively pursued her goals. She was creative and ambitious, willing to leave familiar surroundings behind in search of something larger. That willingness to take chances had brought her from Florida to California, chasing dreams in the music industry. Yet despite her adventurous spirit, Michelle remained grounded by a strong sense of family and responsibility. Those who knew her noticed something else as well. She believed in people, not blindly, not foolishly, but sincerely. When she cared about someone, she invested herself fully. She looked for the good in them. She believed people could overcome mistakes. She believed relationships were worth fighting for. Those beliefs would shape every major decision she made throughout her marriage. When she reunited with Tom in 1991, she didn't see a future criminal. She saw a man who had overcome challenges, a man building a career, a man chasing his own dreams. The attraction wasn't based solely on his appearance or charisma. It was deeper than that. Michelle admired his resilience. She respected the way he seemed determined to create a better future for himself. For a long time, that belief appeared justified. The early years of marriage were genuinely happy. They traveled extensively. They laughed often. They explored the world together. Photos from that period show two people who seemed excited about life and excited about each other. The smiles appear natural. The affection appears real. Looking back, even Michelle never claimed those years were completely fake. That is one of the painful realities of stories like this. Not every memory becomes a lie. Some moments remain genuine. Some happiness remains real, which makes a betrayal even harder to process. As the years passed, Michelle focused on building a future. She worked hard. She developed her career. She contributed to the household. More importantly, she envisioned something increasingly important to her, becoming a mother. By the early 2000s, she was entering her 30s. Like many women, she became aware that certain dreams could not be postponed indefinitely. She and Tom had already enjoyed years of adventure and travel. They had experienced freedom. They had built careers. Now they wanted something different. A family. The decision wasn't impulsive. It reflected a natural progression in their lives. When Michelle became pregnant, she was thrilled. So was Tom, at least initially. Friends remembered his excitement. He talked about the baby constantly. He seemed eager to become a father. For Michelle, the pregnancy represented a new chapter. The carefree years of international travel might be ending, but something even more meaningful was beginning. She accepted a steady position with a record label, seeking stability as they prepared for parenthood. Tom continued advancing his aviation career, flying for wealthy and high-profile clients. Financially, things appeared strong. His income had reached 6 figures. They lived comfortably. On paper, they were succeeding. But pregnancy has a way of revealing truths they're easy to ignore under other circumstances. As Michelle's pregnancy progressed, she noticed something troubling. Tom wasn't slowing down. In fact, he seemed incapable of slowing down. Business trips continued. Surfing trips continued. Golf outings continued. Ski vacations continued. Social gatherings continued. Even as fatherhood approached, Tom behaved like someone unwilling to surrender any part of his previous lifestyle. Michelle tried to be understanding. Relationships require compromise. People adjust to major life changes differently. She told herself he simply needed time, yet a growing discomfort lingered beneath the surface. While she focused on preparing for their child, Tom seemed increasingly focused on escaping responsibility. The difference wasn't dramatic at first. It revealed itself through small observations. The smell of alcohol after social outings, late arrivals, unexplained absences, the sense that he always needed to be somewhere else. Then came another troubling discovery. One day, Michelle overheard a phone conversation. The details initially seemed insignificant. A discussion about placing a sports bet, teams she had never heard of, names she didn't recognize. But something about the conversation unsettled her. When she questioned Tom afterward, his explanation sounded casual. Just betting with a friend. Nothing serious. Nothing unusual. Yet Michelle remained uncomfortable. Because this wasn't merely friendly competition. Money was involved. Risk was involved. And she sensed that Tom wasn't being entirely honest about the extent of his gambling. The issue became their first major warning sign. Not because gambling automatically destroys lives, but because secrecy does. Michelle asked him to stop, or at least reduce the behavior. Tom agreed. He promised he would. And for a time, she believed him. That pattern would repeat itself throughout their marriage. Discovery, confrontation, promise, temporary improvement, then relapse. A cycle that becomes painfully familiar in relationships affected by addiction. In January 2002, Michelle gave birth to their son. The arrival of the baby seemed to transform Tom. For a while, he adored the child. Friends and family noticed it immediately. He appeared deeply attached, proud, protective, emotionally invested. Watching him hold his son, Michelle allowed herself to believe that fatherhood had changed him. Perhaps the gambling phase was over. Perhaps the excessive drinking would fade. Perhaps maturity had finally arrived. Those hopes lasted only a few months. When their son was approximately 3 months old, Michelle experienced a moment that would permanently alter her perception of her husband. Tom was in Mexico on business. Because of communication issues, he asked Michelle to check his voicemail messages. The request seemed ordinary, routine. There was no reason for concern. Then she listened to one of the recordings. A woman's voice. Friendly, intimate, comfortable. Not the voice of a colleague. Not the voice of a client. The message carried the unmistakable tone of someone involved in a personal relationship. Michelle immediately felt her stomach drop. The feeling was instantaneous. Every married person knows that sensation. The moment when reality shifts before proof has fully arrived. She called Tom. Asked directly, who was this woman? The silence that followed told her everything. Not because he confessed immediately, but because his hesitation revealed guilt. When he returned home, he finally admitted the truth. The relationship had been physical. According to Tom, it involved a flight attendant he occasionally encountered while traveling. He attempted to minimize it, attempted to frame it as something limited, something temporary, something that could be repaired. For Michelle, the details hardly mattered. The betrayal itself was devastating. Trust, once broken, never returns unchanged. She looked at him differently after that, not with hatred, not yet, but with disappointment, confusion, disbelief. The man she thought she knew had become capable of something she never expected. Many marriages end at that point. Many people would have walked away. Michelle did not, partly because of her values, partly because of her son, partly because she genuinely loved him. She believed marriage involved enduring difficult seasons. She believed people could make mistakes and recover. She believed counseling might help, so she stayed. The couple entered therapy. Conversations happened. Promises were made. And once again, improvement seemed possible. For a period of time, life stabilized. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough for hope to survive. Enough for Michelle to continue believing the marriage could be saved. Then came another life-changing development. In 2004, she discovered she was pregnant again. The news brought mixed emotions. Joy, excitement, anxiety. The previous years had exposed serious problems in the relationship. Yet she still wanted the family to succeed. She wanted her children to grow up with both parents. She wanted the future she had imagined years earlier when she married Tom. But beneath those hopes lurked uncertainty. Could she truly trust him? Had he genuinely changed? Or had the problem simply gone underground? The answer arrived quickly and painfully. Within weeks, Tom's behavior deteriorated dramatically. The drinking intensified. His absences increased. His mood became unpredictable. Michelle began noticing signs that extended beyond alcohol. Something else was happening. Something darker. There were moments when he seemed almost unrecognizable. His eyes appeared distant. His energy fluctuated wildly. His reactions felt irrational. At times, he seemed agitated without explanation. At other times, detached from reality. Michelle struggled to understand what she was witnessing. The man she married seemed to be disappearing. Not physically, psychologically, emotionally, piece by piece. People around them noticed the changes as well. Friends expressed concern. Family members worried. Even casual observers could sense that something wasn't right. Tom appeared trapped inside some internal battle. He refused to discuss. Yet despite all the warning signs, Michelle still lacked a full picture. She knew about the infidelity. She suspected gambling continued. She feared substance abuse. But she had no idea how deep the problems truly ran. No idea that enormous amounts of money were disappearing. No idea that criminal activity was entering their lives. No idea that federal investigators were already paying attention. As her pregnancy progressed, Michelle focused on what she could control, preparing for another child, caring for her son, maintaining stability, trying to preserve some sense of normalcy. Then In December 2004, her daughter was born. The birth should have been one of the happiest moments of their lives. Instead, something felt wrong. Very wrong. Tom's behavior during the delivery disturbed her. He couldn't sit still, couldn't relax, couldn't focus. He paced constantly, checked his phone repeatedly, moved through the hospital room like a man expecting disaster. Most fathers become emotional during childbirth. Some become nervous. Some become overwhelmed. Tom seemed haunted, as though something outside those hospital walls demanded his attention, as though he carried a secret too heavy to ignore. Michelle noticed it, but she still didn't understand. The truth remained hidden. Only weeks later, she would learn that while she was preparing to welcome their daughter into the world, investigators were preparing a case that would destroy everything. The woman who had spent years believing in loyalty and second chances was about to discover that the greatest betrayal had not yet been revealed. And when it finally emerged, it would not simply break her heart. It would place her children in danger, erase her financial security, dismantle her marriage, and force her to question whether she had ever truly known the man she loved at all. For Michelle Broom, the most painful chapter of her life was about to begin. The warning signs had been there for years, scattered like pieces of a puzzle she could not yet see. Soon, every piece would come together, and the picture would be far more terrifying than she ever imagined. By early 2005, Michelle Broom was exhausted, but she was still fighting for normalcy. Her daughter was only weeks old. Her son was still a toddler. Most of her days revolved around diapers, feeding schedules, laundry, and the endless responsibilities that come with raising young children. Sleep came in short, fragmented stretches. Her body was still recovering from pregnancy. Like many mothers, she had little time to think about herself. Whatever problems existed inside her marriage would have to wait. Right now, her focus was on her children. At least that was what she believed. What Michelle did not know was that events had already been set in motion far beyond her control. Hundreds of miles away, investigators were watching. Prosecutors were building a case. Surveillance operations had been underway for months. Evidence was accumulating. Conversations had been recorded. Flight records had been analyzed. Patterns had been documented. While Michelle was rocking a newborn daughter to sleep, authorities were quietly closing in on her husband. The collision between those two worlds arrived on March 3rd, 2005. At first, the day seemed ordinary. Southern California was wrapped in its usual sunshine. Traffic moved steadily through busy streets. People hurried between appointments and errands. Michelle found herself in a mechanic shop handling a routine problem with her vehicle. It was a kind of mundane task that fills the lives of parents. Nothing about the afternoon hinted that it would become the dividing line between her old life and her new one. Then her cell phone rang. The number displayed a Georgia area code. Immediately, she assumed it was Tom. He was traveling that day. As a pilot, he spent much of his life moving between cities and airports. Calls from unfamiliar numbers were not unusual. She answered without concern. The voice on the other end was not her husband's. The man identified himself as a district attorney. The conversation that followed felt surreal. Michelle listened, confused at first, struggling to understand what she was hearing. The prosecutor spoke carefully, aware that he was delivering information capable of destroying an entire family. He explained that authorities had been monitoring her family for some time. Surveillance had been ongoing. Investigators believed she knew nothing about what was happening. Michelle's confusion deepened. Monitoring her family? Why? What could possibly require surveillance? Then came the answer. Her husband had been arrested, not questioned, not detained for clarification. Arrested. The word seemed impossible. For a few seconds, reality refused to cooperate. The statement simply didn't fit with the image of Tom that existed inside her mind. Pilots got delayed. Pilots got investigated after aviation incidents. Pilots did not get arrested by federal authorities. Yet, the prosecutor continued. Tom had been found with a large quantity of cocaine aboard an airplane. Michelle felt the world tilt beneath her. Cocaine. The word itself seemed absurd. This wasn't a misunderstanding over paperwork. This wasn't an aviation regulation issue. This wasn't a minor offense. This was drug trafficking. Serious drug trafficking. The kind of crime that carried federal consequences and dangerous associations. Then came the final warning. The warning that frightened her more than anything else. The prosecutor told her she and her children could be in danger. Danger. Not financial trouble. Not embarrassment. Not legal complications. Physical danger. The instruction was direct. Disappear. Take whatever precautions she felt necessary. Protect herself and her children. Then the call ended. Just like that. No comforting explanation. No detailed roadmap. No reassurance. Only fear. Michelle stood frozen. The sounds around her faded into the background. Conversations inside the repair shop became distant noise. She struggled to process what she had just heard. Her husband had been arrested with cocaine. Federal authorities had been watching them. Her children might be in danger. Nothing made sense. Yet instinct immediately took over. Whatever questions needed answers could wait. The children came first. Michelle left the shop and began racing through a series of frantic decisions. She collected her children as quickly as possible. Every unfamiliar face suddenly seemed suspicious. Every passing vehicle attracted her attention. Rational or not, fear had already taken hold. Then she made another stop. The bank. If the family truly needed to disappear, they would need money. She walked inside expecting access to the financial resources she and Tom had spent years building. Instead, she discovered another nightmare. The money was gone. Not reduced. Not temporarily unavailable. Gone. Accounts that should have contained savings were empty. Michelle stared at balances that seemed impossible. The numbers didn't match reality. How could this happen? Tom earned a substantial income. For years, he had flown wealthy clients. They had built a comfortable life. Where had the money gone? The answer would arrive later. Gambling. Massive gambling losses. But at that moment, she simply experienced another devastating shock. Within a single afternoon, she had learned that her husband was accused of drug trafficking and that much of their financial security had vanished. The future she thought existed was collapsing in real time. Desperate and overwhelmed, Michelle contacted her sister. The call carried a sense of urgency that immediately communicated the seriousness of the situation. Drop everything. Something terrible had happened. Family members quickly rallied around her. Support systems often reveal their true strength during moments of crisis, and Michelle's family responded without hesitation. Their immediate concern was safety. If prosecutors believed danger existed, they were going to take that warning seriously. Michelle and the children relocated to a relative's home inside a gated community. The move felt unreal. Only hours earlier, she had been managing everyday responsibilities. Now she was effectively in hiding, watching, waiting, wondering, trying to understand how her life had become unrecognizable in a matter of hours. Then the phone rang again. This time it was Tom, calling from jail. The conversation was frustrating from the beginning. Michelle needed answers. She needed explanations. She needed the truth. Who had arrested him? What had happened? Why had authorities been watching them? What was really going on? Tom's responses only increased her anxiety. He refused to discuss details. He repeatedly claimed people were listening. He insisted conversations were being monitored. He urged her to secure his release. Get me home. Then we'll talk. Then I'll explain. For Michelle, the request felt infuriating. The man who had just detonated her entire life was asking for patience, asking for trust, asking for support. Yet despite everything, she still loved him. That emotional conflict would define many of her decisions during the coming months. Fear battled loyalty. Anger battled compassion. Reality battled hope. Tom's bail was set at an astonishing $250,000. The amount reflected the seriousness of the charges. This was not a minor offense. Authorities believed they had caught someone participating in a major narcotics operation. Michelle had nowhere near that amount of money available, especially now that the family accounts appeared depleted. The only option was to seek help. Friends and supporters stepped forward. Money was borrowed. Arrangements were made. The process consumed weeks. Finally, after nearly a month, Tom returned to California. The reunion should have provided clarity. Instead, it deepened the nightmare. When Michelle first saw him after his release, she immediately noticed something different. Not physically, emotionally, his confidence was gone. The charismatic pilot who once seemed capable of handling any situation now looked defeated, embarrassed, exposed, like a man caught standing in the ruins of his own decisions. Eventually, the confessions began, one by one, layer by layer, each revelation worse than the last. Tom admitted the gambling had spiraled out of control, far beyond what Michelle ever imagined. The family savings had vanished into bets and losses, years of financial security erased. Money earned through countless flights and business opportunities had disappeared. Michelle listened in disbelief. The realization felt crushing. Every plan they had built depended on financial stability, their children's future, their home, their security. All of it had been jeopardized. Yet gambling was only part of the story. There was still the question of the cocaine, the question that frightened everyone, the question prosecutors were preparing to answer in federal court. Tom explained that after losing enormous amounts of money, he became desperate. Desperation is dangerous. It narrows vision. It creates justifications. It transforms risks into opportunities. Somewhere in Los Angeles, Tom met a man offering exactly what desperate people crave: fast money, easy money, huge money. The arrangement sounded simple. Fly a plane between Los Angeles and Atlanta. No passengers, only luggage, no questions. Every trip would generate tens of thousands of dollars. For someone drowning in debt and addiction, the temptation proved overwhelming. Tom accepted. Again and again and again, the flights continued. Cash flowed. Questions remained unasked, at least publicly, but privately. Even Michelle struggled to believe complete ignorance was possible. Who pays enormous sums to transport locked suitcases across the country? Why insist on secrecy? Why avoid scrutiny? The answer seemed obvious. Yet Tom claimed he never knew precisely what was inside. Then came the details of his arrest. The final flight. The flight that ended everything. Authorities stopped him during a routine inspection. Initially, nothing appeared unusual. Documentation was presented. Licenses were reviewed. Questions were asked. Then investigators requested access to a specific compartment, a locked compartment. Tom claimed he lacked the key. That answer triggered further scrutiny. Drug detection dogs were brought in. Within moments, the animals alerted aggressively. The compartment became the center of attention. Investigators opened it. Inside, they found suitcases, 4 of them, packed with cocaine. Not small quantities, not personal use amounts. 65 kilograms, pure cocaine. Millions of dollars in street value. Enough narcotics to destroy countless lives. Enough evidence to destroy his own. As Michelle listened to the details, another horrifying truth emerged. The man behind the operation wasn't merely a criminal associate, an organization whose reputation inspired fear even among experienced law enforcement officers. At that moment, the prosecutor's warning suddenly made sense. The danger, the surveillance, the urgency, the fear. This wasn't simply about drugs. It was about organized crime. The realization settled over Michelle like ice water. Her children had unknowingly been living adjacent to a criminal network. Her family had become vulnerable because of decisions she never knew existed. And the man responsible was sitting directly across from her. The husband she had trusted, the father of her children, the stranger she no longer recognized. As the conversation ended and the realities settled into place, one thing became painfully clear. The arrest itself was not the true catastrophe. The catastrophe was everything it revealed. Years of lies, years of secrets, years of hidden addictions and concealed debts. The cocaine discovered aboard that airplane had exposed far more than a criminal operation. It had exposed the collapse of an entire life. And for Michelle Broom, the nightmare was only beginning. The arrest in Georgia was merely the first explosion. The investigations, the financial ruin, the legal battles, and the complete destruction of her marriage still lay ahead. Soon she would discover that the truth was even darker than Tom's confession, and that some betrayals leave scars long after prison sentences have been served. By the time Michelle Broom reached her sister's gated community, the world she had known only hours earlier no longer felt real. The road she had driven 1,000 times seemed unfamiliar, as if she were moving through someone else's life. Every turn felt heavier than the last. Every stoplight an interruption she could not afford. In the back seat, her children slept or cried in uneven rhythms. Too young to understand that their lives had just shifted into something unstable and uncertain. Michelle kept checking the rear-view mirror, not out of habit, but out of instinct. The district attorney's words echoed in her mind with an insistence she could not silence. Surveillance, arrest, danger, disappear. Each word carried weight, each one building pressure inside her chest until it felt like she could barely breathe. When she finally arrived, the security gate closed behind her with mechanical finality that felt symbolic. Inside those walls, there was safety, or at least the illusion of it. Family members were already waiting, drawn together by urgency and fear. There were no long explanations at first, no careful unpacking of events. Instead, there were immediate actions, rapid decisions made in the absence of full understanding. Doors were locked, phones were checked, conversations were lowered into urgent whispers. Michelle sat down, still holding her infant daughter, trying to process what had happened, but her mind refused to settle into anything coherent. The phrase her husband arrested kept repeating itself, but it collided violently with everything she thought she knew about Tom. Arrested for what? That question circled endlessly, refusing to resolve. Within hours, the family began to understand that this was not a misunderstanding or a minor legal issue. Calls came and that confirmed pieces of the story, each one more disturbing than the last. Tom was not simply detained. He was facing serious federal charges. Cocaine had been found on his aircraft. Not a small amount, not a questionable substance, but a large, undeniable quantity that suggested organized trafficking. The words felt unreal when spoken aloud inside a quiet living room filled with family members trying to protect children from the truth. Michelle listened in silence, her arms wrapped tightly around her daughter, as if physical closeness alone could prevent everything from falling apart. But the most unsettling part was not even the arrest itself. It was what followed. The bank. Michelle had gone there almost instinctively, driven by the need to secure whatever resources remained. She remembered standing in front of the teller, holding her breath as she waited for confirmation that their savings were still intact. Instead, she was met with confusion, then disbelief, then a slow, sinking realization that the accounts she thought would sustain her family were empty. The money was gone, not delayed, not frozen, gone. She asked again, certain there had to be a mistake. There was no mistake. The numbers did not change. The reality did not shift. It simply remained there, cold and final, refusing to offer explanation. In that moment, the financial foundation of her life collapsed just as violently as the emotional one. Back at her sister's house, Michelle made the first of many phone calls that would define the coming days. She called Tom's number repeatedly, each attempt ending the same way, unanswered or redirected. Eventually, he called her instead. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but it carried none of the warmth she associated with him. It sounded strained, distant, and strangely defensive. He spoke from jail, but even that detail felt secondary to the emotional distance between them. Michelle demanded answers, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. She asked about the arrest, about the drugs, about the surveillance, about the money. Each question was met with resistance. Tom would not explain everything over the phone. He said they were listening. He could not talk freely. He needed her to bring him home first. Then he would explain everything. But trust, once fractured, does not respond easily to promises made under confinement. Michelle hung up feeling even more disoriented than before. Instead of clarity, she was left with fragments, words without context, claims without evidence, fear without direction. Over the next several days, reality began to take shape in pieces she never wanted to assemble. Attorneys entered the picture. Bail discussions began. Friends who had once known Tom reacted with disbelief that slowly turned to concern as more information emerged. It was no longer just an arrest. It was an investigation with reach and depth. Federal agents were involved. Surveillance had been ongoing. Evidence was being compiled from multiple sources. Flight logs, financial records, communications, patterns that stretched far beyond a single incident. Michelle tried to follow each development, but the information overwhelmed her. It was like trying to drink from a broken pipe. Moment of clarity interrupted by floods of confusion. She learned that Tom's bail had been set at a staggering amount, far beyond what their depleted finances could cover. The realization that they were effectively trapped in this situation financially added another layer of panic. The life they had built, the savings they had accumulated, the sense of stability she had relied on, all of it had already been compromised long before she knew there was a problem. The explanation for the missing money began to surface slowly. Gambling. At first, it sounded almost too ordinary to be connected to something so catastrophic. But as details emerged, the scale of it became impossible to ignore. Tom had been gambling heavily for years. Not casually, not occasionally, but compulsively, in amounts that steadily drained their accounts. Losses that accumulated silently, while life on the surface continued to appear normal. Payments made, bills covered, trips taken. Meanwhile, underneath it all, the foundation was being eroded transaction by transaction. Michelle struggled to reconcile this version of her husband with the man she thought she had married. She remembered conversations, shared plans, decisions they had made together about their future. None of it accounted for this hidden behavior, yet the evidence was undeniable. Bank records did not lie. Financial gaps did not appear by accident. Still, gambling alone could not explain everything. There was something else. The flights, the unexplained trips, the sudden opportunities involving large sums of cash. As investigators later explained to her in fragments, Tom had begun flying cargo for individuals he met in Los Angeles. The arrangement, as he described it, seemed simple at first. No passengers, just luggage, high pay, minimal questions. For someone already under financial pressure, it had appeared to be an easy solution, but nothing about it was truly simple. Each flight carried risks he either ignored or chose not to fully acknowledge. Michelle learned that investigators had been tracking patterns long before the arrest. Flights with unusual routing, sudden changes in destination, irregularities in flight documentation, instances where aircraft tail numbers were altered mid-route, a tactic commonly associated with illegal operations. These were not random events. They formed a pattern, one that law enforcement had been carefully documenting over time. The discovery of 4 suitcases filled with cocaine was not an isolated surprise. It was a culmination of months of observation and suspicion. Still, Michelle struggled with one central question. Did Tom know what he was carrying? His explanation was inconsistent. At times, he claimed ignorance, insisting he believed he was transporting legitimate cargo for clients who preferred privacy. At other times, his behavior suggested awareness that something was wrong, but a willingness to proceed anyway because of financial desperation. The truth, as it often is in cases like this, seemed tangled between denial, justification, and avoidance. What Michelle did understand clearly, however, was a reaction of law enforcement. This was not treated as a mistake. It was treated as participation. Investigators described communication records that linked Tom to individuals involved in organized trafficking networks. Meetings had been arranged. Contacts had been established. Handovers had taken place. In one instance, he had allegedly delivered suitcases directly to a recipient in Georgia, a detail that eliminated any possibility of accidental involvement in the broader operation. Each new detail pushed Michelle further away from the image of the man she had loved. And yet, emotionally, she remained caught between 2 versions of him. The husband who had held their newborn son with visible joy, and the man accused of transporting millions of dollars worth of narcotics for a criminal organization. The contradiction was unbearable. Days turned into a blur of legal consultations, family discussions, and sleepless nights. Michelle moved through them in a state of emotional suspension, responding to what needed to be done while internally trying to hold herself together. Her children remained the only stable point in her life. When she looked at them, she was reminded that whatever happened next, she had responsibilities that could not collapse. But even that stability felt fragile, because the district attorney's warning still lingered. Danger was not theoretical. It was part of the reality she now inhabited. The idea that her family could be connected to individuals capable of violence was no longer abstract. It was embedded in the case itself, in the networks being described, in the organizations being referenced, in the urgency of the instructions she had received to disappear. Michelle began to understand that she was no longer simply a wife dealing with a husband's arrest. She was a potential witness, a potential target, a variable in a much larger investigation. As the initial shock of March 3rd began to settle into something more structured, a painful clarity emerged. The life she had built with Tom had not been what it appeared. The financial stability had been illusory. The trust had been compromised long before she recognized it. The man she married had been living a life divided between public image and private behavior, and those two worlds had finally collided in the most devastating way possible. But even then, the full story had not yet revealed itself, because what Michelle did not know, what she could not yet comprehend, was that the investigation was still expanding. New evidence was still being uncovered, and the deeper authorities dug into Tom Broom's activities, the more complex and more dangerous the truth would become. By the time formal investigations began to take shape, Michelle Broom was already living in a state of emotional exhaustion that felt like it had no end. The initial shock of Tom's arrest had not faded. Instead, it had deepened, spreading into every part of her daily existence. Sleep became fragmented, meals became forgettable, and time itself seemed to lose structure. Each day brought new fragments of information, and none of them formed a comforting whole. Instead, they built a picture that was increasingly difficult to face. Federal investigators did not arrive with simple explanations. They arrived with patterns, timelines, and evidence that stretched back months, even years. At first, Michelle tried to understand the situation as a single mistake, a tragic collapse of judgment under pressure. That explanation was easier to hold on to because it preserved something of the man she had known. But the more she listened, the less that version of events could survive. Tom's name was not attached to one suspicious flight. It was attached to many. Authorities described a consistent pattern that no longer resembled coincidence. Flights originating from Los Angeles to Atlanta and back again, often without passengers, often with unusual cargo arrangements. Aircraft logs showed inconsistencies that could not be easily explained. On certain trips, tail numbers appeared to shift during routing, a detail that immediately raised red flags among investigators familiar with smuggling operations. These were not minor irregularities. They were signs of deliberate manipulation. Michelle sat through explanations with a growing sense of disconnection, as if she were listening to a story about someone else's life. The man being described in these reports did not align with the husband she had married, yet every detail pointed back to him. It was not just the flights. It was the contacts, the communications, the meetings arranged under specific conditions, the financial transactions that no longer made sense when placed against legitimate income. One investigator carefully explained that in cases like this, transportation is rarely accidental. People do not repeatedly carry sealed luggage across state lines for large sums of cash without at least suspecting that something illegal is involved. The language was measured, professional, and calm, but its implication was devastating. It suggested awareness. It suggested participation. It suggested choice. Michelle tried to push back against that conclusion, not out of denial alone, but out of the need to preserve some coherent understanding of the man she had built her life with. She repeated what Tom had said to her from jail, that he did not know exactly what was inside the suitcases, that he had been misled by clients who presented themselves as legitimate businessmen. But even as she spoke those words, she could hear how fragile they sounded in the face of what investigators were presenting, because there were other details that were harder to explain away. Phone records showed communication patterns that linked Tom to individuals under surveillance for narcotics trafficking. Financial deposits appeared in amounts inconsistent with standard aviation contracts. Witness statements suggested that he had personally delivered cargo to specific locations and individuals. In one instance, Investigators described a handoff in Georgia that aligned precisely with the timing of his flights. Each piece of evidence, on its own, might have been open to interpretation. Together, they formed something far more difficult to dismiss. As Michelle absorbed this information, she felt something inside her shift, not suddenly, but gradually, like a structure weakening under pressure. It was never designed to hold. She had entered this process hoping for clarity, hoping to separate misunderstanding from truth. Instead, she was being pulled into a space where certainty no longer existed. Outside the investigation, her personal life continued to unravel in quieter ways. Financial documents confirmed what she had already suspected in fragments. The family's resources had not simply been strained. They had been systematically depleted. Gambling losses were not occasional missteps, but part of a sustained pattern of behavior that had drained accounts over time. The numbers were staggering in ways she struggled to comprehend. Money earned over years of hard work had disappeared into transactions she had never known about. This revelation brought a different kind of pain. Not the shock of criminal allegations, but the betrayal of silence. She replayed moments from their life together, searching for signs she had missed. Conversations about finances that seemed normal at the time. Decisions about travel and spending that now carried hidden meaning. She realized how easily trust can conceal truth when it is not questioned. Yet even with gambling and financial deception now visible, the investigation still pointed further outward, into something far more dangerous. The criminal network investigators' reference was not abstract. It had structure, it had reach, and it had consequences for those involved. Michelle was shown fragments of intelligence that linked Tom's activities to individuals associated with organized trafficking operations operating across international routes. The name that surfaced repeatedly carried weight in every room it was mentioned. A network known for enforcing loyalty through fear, maintaining control through intimidation, and eliminating risks without hesitation. For Michelle, these details changed the emotional landscape of the case entirely. What had once felt like a personal tragedy was now something larger, something that extended beyond her marriage. She was no longer just processing betrayal. She was confronting the possibility that her family had been adjacent to a world where mistakes carried consequences far beyond financial ruin or prison sentences. The district attorney's earlier warning began to make more sense in retrospect. Surveillance had not been a formality. It had been precaution. The suggestion to disappear had not been dramatic language. It had been instruction grounded in experience. Michelle found herself constantly evaluating her surroundings in ways she never had before. She noticed cars parked too long on quiet streets. She became aware of unfamiliar faces in places she visited regularly. Whether these observations reflected real surveillance or heightened anxiety was impossible to determine. But the psychological effect was the same. Her sense of safety had been permanently altered. At night, when the house was quiet, she would sit awake replaying everything she had learned. The image of Tom in the hospital with their newborn daughter, unable to sit still, constantly on his phone, now carried a different weight. At the time, she had interpreted it as stress or emotional overwhelm. Now it felt like something else. A man caught between two lives, struggling to maintain balance between responsibilities and obligations she had not yet understood. Even his absences during her pregnancy took on new meaning. The frequent travel, the unexplained delays, the sudden financial strain that seemed to appear without clear cause. Each memory shifted under the pressure of new information, as though the past itself was being rewritten in real time. Still, despite everything, there remained moments of resistance within her understanding, moments where she could not fully accept a version of Tom being presented by investigators, because that version required her to believe not only that he had made catastrophic decisions, but that he had lived a double life for years without her awareness. It required her to accept that intimacy and deception had coexisted in ways she never imagined. That psychological conflict created a constant tension inside her. One part of her demanded clarity and accountability. Another part still reached the memory of the man she had loved, the father of her children, the person who had once shared her dreams and ambitions. Investigators, however, were not working with emotion. They were working with evidence. And the evidence continued to accumulate. Flight logs expanded. Financial trails deepened. Communication records widened the scope of individuals involved. Each new piece of information reinforced the same conclusion. Tom Broom was not an incidental participant in a single criminal event. He was part of a sustained operation that had functioned over time, involving repeated actions that required coordination, trust, and awareness. By the end of the investigative phase, she was exposed at that stage. Michelle was forced to confront a reality she had avoided since the beginning. The man she had offended in her mind as possibly misled or manipulated was now being described in terms that suggested ongoing involvement in illegal activity, regardless of whether he fully understood every aspect of it. The ambiguity that remained did not provide comfort. It only deepened the uncertainty. Because even if Tom had not known everything, he had known enough. Enough to question, enough to refuse, enough to stop. And he had not. As Michelle left one of the meetings with legal representatives and investigators, she stepped outside into ordinary daylight that felt strangely disconnected from the reality she now inhabited. Cars moved through intersections. People walked along sidewalks. Life continued in its normal rhythm. But for her, nothing felt normal anymore. She understood now that the investigation was no longer just about what Tom had done. It was about what his actions had revealed about the structure of their entire life. Every assumption she had made about stability, partnership, and shared reality was being dismantled piece by piece. And somewhere beyond the documents, beyond the reports, beyond the carefully constructed legal language, there remained a truth she was still not ready to fully confront. The story of Tom Broom was not finished. It was only beginning to reveal how far it had already gone. The ocean has always had a way of making people believe in second chances. Out there, far from the noise of ordinary life, surrounded only by endless water and shifting horizons, it becomes easy to imagine that the past can be left behind just as quickly as the shoreline disappears. For Cynthia Castile, that illusion became almost tangible the moment she stepped onto an Alaskan cruise ship in the spring of 1998. She was 45 years old, recently divorced, emotionally bruised in ways she rarely admitted aloud, and quietly searching for something she could not quite name. Not necessarily love, not exactly redemption, something softer, something that felt like possibility. The ship itself felt like a floating city suspended between worlds. White metal corridors reflected soft light from overhead fixtures. The hum of engines vibrated gently beneath every conversation. Passengers moved through dining halls, observation decks, and lounges with the carefree energy of people who had temporarily escaped their responsibilities. For Cynthia, working in customer relations aboard the ship, it was both a job and a form of emotional distance. She was no longer in the small Oregon town where every street carried memory. She was surrounded by strangers, shifting ports, and the constant motion of the sea. It was here, in this environment of movement and reinvention, that she met Wayne Chin. At first, he did not appear particularly extraordinary in a way that would suggest danger. He was outgoing, socially confident, and immediately comfortable in conversation. He moved through the ship's spaces as if he belonged everywhere at once, greeting crew members and passengers alike with ease that made people feel noticed. There was a warmth to him that seemed genuine, almost disarming. He laughed easily, listened attentively, and carried himself with a kind of quiet assurance that suggested experience rather than arrogance. To Cynthia, who had spent years rebuilding her sense of self after betrayal, that attention felt like sunlight after a long winter. She noticed him first in a casual moment, the kind that usually fades into memory without consequence. Flowers had been arranged somewhere on the ship, and she had been trying to gather them into something resembling a bouquet. Not because they were hers, but because they were simply there, occupying space. Wayne approached with curiosity rather than intrusion. He asked if they belonged to her. When she replied no, he did not simply move on. He stayed present in the moment, as if her answer mattered in a way that small talk rarely does. That afternoon, when she returned to her cabin, there was a bouquet waiting for her. No explanation needed. No request for acknowledgement. Just flowers and a card. In that simple gesture, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with the clarity of warning bells or obvious manipulation, but subtly, like a door quietly opening in a room she had not realized was locked. The next day, They spoke more directly. Conversation flowed easily, as if they had already known each other longer than they actually had. Wayne spoke about himself with confidence. He told her he had served in the Navy, that he still worked as a reserve officer, that he had learned discipline and purpose through service to his country. The detail mattered to Cynthia in a way she did not fully question at the time. It created an impression of stability, of structure, of someone who lived by values larger than himself. In her mind, it added credibility to everything else she was beginning to feel. And what she was beginning to feel was attention. For someone who had spent years recovering from emotional abandonment, attention did not arrive as something small. It arrived as significance, as meaning, as proof that she still existed in a world where she had once felt invisible. Wayne gave her that sense immediately. He did not hesitate in expressing interest. He did not approach slowly or cautiously. Instead, he came forward with certainty that made his intentions unmistakable. Within days, he told her directly that he intended to make her his wife. To an outsider, the statement might have seemed premature, even reckless. But to Cynthia, still emotionally vulnerable from her previous marriage, it carried a strange mixture of flattery and hope. It suggested decisiveness. It suggested commitment. It suggested that someone had seen her and decided she was worth choosing without hesitation. At that stage, caution rarely competes successfully with emotional hunger. Wayne's personal story only deepened that emotional pull. He spoke of a painful divorce, of betrayal, of a woman who had left him after infidelity involving another man. He described himself as someone who had been deeply wounded but still believed in love. The story mirrored, in many ways, Cynthia's own past. That similarity created a sense of emotional symmetry between them. It felt like shared understanding, shared experience, shared survival. When people recognize their pain in someone else, they often mistake reflection for compatibility. In that early phase, Wayne was attentive in ways that felt almost cinematic. Small gestures appeared at exactly the right moments. Words arrived with perfect timing. He seemed to understand emotional needs without needing them explained. To someone rebuilding trust, these behaviors did not appear calculated. They appeared comforting. Within a month, their relationship escalated quickly. There was intensity, urgency, and emotional momentum that left little room for hesitation. Cynthia found herself speaking about him to friends with excitement she had not felt in years. She described him as kind, sensitive, fun, and deeply engaging. The absence of romantic attention in her life, for so long, made his presence feel even more pronounced. When someone re-enters your emotional world after years of silence, their voice can feel louder than it truly is. Then came the proposal. It happened not in a formal setting, but in a moment designed to feel intimate. He led her into a small space on the ship, something like a cooler or storage area, away from the public eye. There, without ceremony, he placed a ring into her hand, an emerald and diamond ring that caught light in a way that felt symbolic, almost staged by memory itself. He spoke about faithfulness, about promises, about a shared future that would last for life. For Cynthia, it was not just an engagement. It was restoration. It was a return of identity she had almost stopped believing she deserved. Soon after, however, the emotional tone of their story shifted. The cruise ended. The ship docked in San Francisco. The floating world of temporary escape gave way to land, routine, and consequence. It was here that Wayne introduced the first of many devastating revelations. He told her that his children, both of them, had died in a sudden car accident while trying to surprise him. The story arrived with emotional intensity, grief pouring through his words in a way that felt impossible to fabricate. He cried openly, speaking of loss, of shock, of being unable to attend funerals. Cynthia responded as most compassionate people would in that moment. She held him. She comforted him. She absorbed his grief as if it were shared. The emotional bond between them deepened immediately. Grief, especially when shared, can accelerate intimacy faster than joy ever does. And Wayne understood that dynamic with unsettling precision. Even in the midst of tragedy, he pushed forward with urgency toward marriage. He spoke about fate, about timing, about how life brings people together for reasons beyond understanding. The message was consistent. There was no time to delay. Their connection was too meaningful to pause. 2 weeks later, they were married in a small ceremony in Oregon. It was not extravagant, but it felt personal. Family attended, friends gathered. There was homemade food, a cake prepared by her mother, and a sense of emotional celebration that filled the space with warmth. Cynthia stood in that moment believing she was entering a new chapter defined by stability and companionship. What she did not yet know was that this chapter had been carefully constructed on layers of carefully placed falsehoods. After the wedding, they settled into what appeared to be ordinary life. They worked together managing a motel on the Oregon coast. The rhythm of daily tasks, customer interactions, and shared responsibilities created the illusion of stability. From the outside, they appeared like a functioning couple building a life side by side. Cynthia believed she had finally found permanence. But permanence is often the first illusion to collapse when deception is present. Strange inconsistencies began to surface. Wayne's stories about his military service did not align with logistical realities. His absences and explanations for travel began to feel vague under closer inspection. The idea that he was participating in Naval Reserve duties raised questions among those around him who understood geography and military structure more clearly. The locations he claimed to visit did not match the nature of his alleged service. At first, Cynthia dismissed these concerns. Trust, once established emotionally, resists immediate contradiction. But doubt has a way of accumulating. Small inconsistencies that might have been ignored individually began to form patterns when viewed together. Conversations with others introduced questions she had not considered. Emails he received appeared informal, in ways that did not match official military communication. Details that once felt impressive now felt slightly misaligned. Still, even as cracks began to appear, Cynthia held on to belief, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she had already invested emotionally in the identity of the relationship. Walking away would require not just leaving a partner, but dismantling a narrative she had already accepted as truth. And then came the sheriff. The visit was sudden, unexpected, and disruptive. In the middle of their work life, a deputy arrived asking for Wayne. The question alone shifted the atmosphere immediately. Legal attention rarely arrives without reason. Cynthia felt the change instantly, like temperature dropping in a room. What followed was the first direct confrontation between her belief in Wayne and the reality surrounding him. The investigation into his past would eventually reveal a pattern of deception that extended far beyond minor misunderstandings. But at that moment, standing in a motel lobby as law enforcement asked questions about her new husband, Cynthia was still trying to reconcile two incompatible realities: the man she loved and the man the law was now searching for. Between those two versions of reality, something fragile began to fracture. The sheriff's presence did not leave immediately. Even after the initial questions were asked, even after Wayne stepped out of the motel office with that uneasy expression that tried to pass for confusion, the air inside the building did not return to normal. It lingered, heavy and charged, as if something invisible had been released into the space and refused to leave. Cynthia remembered the way customers paused at the front desk longer than usual that day, the way conversations in the hallway dropped into silence whenever footsteps approached. A single visit from law enforcement had the power to change the emotional temperature of an entire place, and now it had done the same to her marriage. Wayne's explanation came quickly, almost too quickly, as if rehearsed in advance or repeated enough times that it rolled off his tongue without hesitation. He spoke of misunderstanding, of mistaken identity, of a situation involving people around him rather than him directly. He claimed a housekeeper and her boyfriend had used a guest debit card, and somehow his name had been drawn into the situation. The explanation had structure, but not depth. It filled space without resolving uncertainty. It was the kind of story that sounded complete when spoken quickly, but began to unravel when examined closely. Cynthia listened, searching his face for something that might anchor her understanding. She wanted to see fear, guilt, or even frustration directed at the injustice of the situation. Instead, what she saw was controlled irritation, a sense that the interruption was inconvenient rather than catastrophic. That detail stayed with her, even though at the time she tried to ignore it. People who are wrongly accused usually feel overwhelmed by the accusation itself. Wayne seemed more focused on the disruption it caused his day. When authorities ran his name, the surface explanation collapsed almost immediately. There was more than a single accusation. There was a warrant. There was a history. Another state. Another case. Washington came into the conversation like a shadow extending backward in time, revealing that Wayne Chin was not unknown to the system. He was already documented, already flagged, already part of a legal narrative that existed long before Cynthia ever met him on a cruise ship. The charge was forgery. The secondary issue was bail jumping, meaning he had already failed to comply with legal obligations in a previous case. These were not misunderstandings. They were patterns of avoidance. For law enforcement, this shifted the situation from isolated incident to ongoing behavior. For Cynthia, however, the emotional processing lagged behind the facts. She was still standing in the space between belief and evidence, trying to reconcile the man she woke up next to with a man being described by officers with quiet certainty. Wayne did not present himself as someone unraveling under exposure. Instead, he remained composed, almost frustrated, insisting that everything had been exaggerated or misrepresented. That contrast created internal conflict in Cynthia that would define the next phase of her life with him. When Wayne later told her that a former partner had fabricated accusations out of anger, it provided just enough emotional relief to slow her rising doubts. The story had a familiar structure: a breakup, financial dispute, revenge through legal systems. It was a narrative that many people had heard before, and that familiarity made it easier to accept. He positioned himself as a victim of misunderstanding rather than wrongdoing, and Cynthia, still emotionally invested, leaned toward the explanation that preserved trust rather than destroyed it. But trust in situations like this does not remain stable. It accumulates weight. Soon after, financial consequences entered their lives with force. Legal defense was not abstract. It required money, large amounts of it. Cynthia, believing in his innocence, made decisions that felt aligned with loyalty. She signed checks. She authorized payments. She committed thousands of dollars toward defending him, convinced that once the misunderstanding was resolved, everything would return to normal. At the time, this felt like support. In retrospect, it would become part of a much larger financial erosion she could not yet see. Wayne was eventually released. 5 weeks after his arrest, he returned to their life as if attempting to resume continuity. The moment of his return did not feel like resolution. It felt like re-entry into a story that had been temporarily paused but not clarified. His demeanor carried something different now, a subtle shift that Cynthia struggled to define. There was familiarity, but also a faint sense of distance, as if something between them had been altered during his absence. Still, life continued. They moved forward, or at least appeared to. They found new work together managing a restaurant, attempting to rebuild stability through shared responsibility. The ocean became part of their daily backdrop again, this time through food instead of travel. The restaurant was positioned near the coast, and they built an identity around it, even creating a phrase that connected their concept to the sea, as if branding could reinforce unity. For a time, routine provided structure that masked uncertainty. Work shifts, customer interactions, planning menus, handling staff, these tasks created rhythm. In that rhythm, doubt became less immediate. People can tolerate uncertainty more easily when they're busy. But life has a way of interrupting stability at unexpected moments. One afternoon, a sheriff arrived again. This time, the reason was not vague suspicion or background inquiry. It was a warrant violation. Wayne had failed to appear in court related to his earlier charges. The moment he was taken away, there was no ambiguity left about whether legal issues were real. The system was now actively pursuing him, not simply observing. Cynthia described the feeling as being struck physically, as if something had hit her chest and left her unable to process breath normally. The public nature of the arrest intensified the emotional impact. Employees saw it. Customers saw it. The space she had worked to stabilize was suddenly disrupted in front of witnesses. When Wayne was gone, the silence that followed was heavier than his presence had been. Prison, when it came, was not immediate in emotional terms, even though it became real in legal terms. Wayne was sentenced to serve time in Washington state. For Cynthia, this introduced a new reality: separation enforced not by choice, but by consequence. Visiting him in prison meant confronting the accumulated weight of unresolved questions while maintaining the emotional role she had already committed to. During visits, she noticed changes in his tone. He spoke with less energy, sometimes with fatigue, but also a continued insistence that his core innocence remained intact. The inconsistencies in his story did not disappear. Instead, they adapted. Explanations shifted slightly, adjusted to accommodate new information without fully resolving contradictions. This adaptability made it difficult to find a stable point of truth. At the same time, Cynthia's emotional attachment did not dissolve immediately. Instead, it evolved into something more complicated. She was no longer simply a wife in a normal relationship. She had become someone invested in the outcome of a legal and emotional puzzle that she could not fully solve. Hope became intertwined with doubt, and neither could fully override the other. When Wayne was eventually released after serving time, the return did not restore what had been lost. Instead, it marked the beginning of a different phase, one that carried the residue of prison, legal obligations, and financial strain. Yet despite everything, Cynthia still attempted to rebuild what remained of their relationship. There was a sense of obligation, but also emotional inertia. Years of investment do not disappear easily, even when evidence suggests they should. Wayne, for his part, appeared eager to reset their lives. He spoke about the future, about opportunities, about plans that required optimism. He organized a birthday celebration for Cynthia, an event that was meant to symbolize renewal. It was framed as thoughtful, a gesture of care, a moment of celebration after hardship. But even in carefully constructed optimism, instability can surface. The night before the celebration, a call arrived that disrupted everything again. Wayne claimed his parole officer had scheduled an in-home visit for the next day. The timing conflicted directly with the event he had planned. According to him, it was unavoidable. According to Cynthia, it was frustrating but believable. She was forced to attend her own celebration alone, driving hours away while he remained behind for what he described as legal compliance. What she encountered at the event location, however, shattered that belief entirely. There was no reservation, no booking, no preparation, no sign that any celebration had been arranged. Staff at the venue had no record of the event. No payment had been made. No coordination existed. The gathering she had been promised did not exist outside a conversation. In that moment, something fundamental changed in Cynthia's perception. This was no longer about legal misunderstandings or isolated mistakes. This was about deliberate fabrication of reality. When she confronted Wayne afterward, the explanation shifted again. The venue had made a mistake. The parole system had been miscommunicated. The inconsistencies multiplied rather than resolved. And for the first time, Cynthia did not accept the explanation, even if she was not yet ready to fully reject him. Instead, she began to investigate. She contacted the parole office directly. She asked simple questions. Did in-home visits occur across state lines? The answer was no. Clear, immediate, undeniable. That single confirmation created a rupture in her perception that could not be easily reversed. The man she had trusted was not simply making mistakes. He was constructing narratives that did not align with institutional reality. And once that realization entered her awareness, everything that came before began to shift in meaning. Nothing was stable anymore. Not memory, not explanation, not even love. Cynthia Castile had always defined herself through the idea of devotion, not in a passive sense, but as a conscious choice she made again and again throughout her life. She believed in staying, in repairing, in holding relationships together even when they bent under pressure. That belief did not come from naivety alone. It came from experience, from a first marriage that collapsed under the weight of betrayal when her husband had an affair with someone she once considered a friend. That wound did not just end a relationship. It reshaped how she understood trust, loyalty, and her own sense of worth. In the years that followed that first collapse, Cynthia lived in a quiet emotional recovery. There were no dramatic reinventions of self, no sudden shifts into independence narratives. Instead, there was a slow rebuilding of daily life, work, friendships, routines, and underneath all of it, a lingering question she rarely said out loud. Why was it not enough? Why did love fail even when she believed she was giving everything correctly? That question never fully disappeared. It simply went dormant. When she left Oregon in 1998 to work on an Alaskan cruise ship, it was not an escape in the dramatic sense people often imagine. It was more practical, more grounded. A suggestion from a friend, a job opportunity, a change of scenery that offered distance from emotional memory. She told herself she was simply trying something new, but beneath that surface decision was a quieter desire. She wanted to feel life again without the shadow of failure following her into every room. The cruise ship became an environment where identity felt temporarily suspended. Passengers came and went. Cities appeared and disappeared along the coastline. Conversations were brief, intense, and then gone. In that impermanence, Cynthia felt less weighed down by her past. She worked in customer relations, interacted with travelers who were themselves suspended between lives. People on cruises often behave differently than they do on land. They are more open, more expressive, more willing to believe in small moments of connection because they know those moments are temporary. It was in this setting that she met Wayne Chin. At first, he did not stand out as someone dangerous or deceptive. He stood out as someone present. He had a way of occupying space that felt confident but not aggressive. He spoke easily, listened attentively, and carried a kind of social fluency that made interactions feel effortless. For Cynthia, who had been emotionally isolated for years, that ease felt like oxygen slowly returning. She noticed how quickly he engaged with people around him. He was not just friendly. He was socially magnetic. Crew members responded to him with familiarity, passengers with curiosity. He moved through the ship as if it were an extension of his personality rather than a workplace or environment. That kind of ease often reads as trustworthiness, especially to someone who is not actively looking for deception. The first gesture that shifted their dynamic was small enough to be dismissed as coincidence if she had wanted to. Flowers arranged in a shared space, a casual interaction, a question about whether they belonged to her. When she said no, she did not expect anything to follow. But later that day, flowers appeared at her cabin, not delivered publicly, not announced, just placed with intention. That kind of private acknowledgement carries psychological weight. It creates a sense of being individually seen. Cynthia did not interpret it as manipulation. She interpreted it as attentiveness. The next stage of their connection unfolded quickly, almost without resistance. Wayne expressed interest in a way that was direct rather than cautious. He did not build slowly toward emotional availability. He declared intention early, speaking about future commitment within days of meeting her. Under normal circumstances, that level of intensity might have raised concern, but within the emotional context Cynthia was living in, it felt like certainty. And certainty, after years of emotional ambiguity, can feel like relief. He told her he had served in the Navy, that he was currently involved in reserve duties, that discipline and structure were central to his identity. That detail mattered to Cynthia more than she consciously realized. Military affiliation suggested stability, responsibility, and moral alignment. It placed him within a framework of respectability that contrasted sharply with the emotional instability of her past marriage. She did not interrogate the claim. It fit too comfortably into the narrative she wanted to believe. As their conversations deepened, Wayne revealed personal history that mirrored her own emotional wounds. He spoke of a painful divorce, of betrayal, of a partner who had left him under humiliating circumstances. He described emotional loss with detail that felt authentic, and Cynthia, recognizing familiar pain, felt a sense of shared understanding form between them. Shared pain can create rapid intimacy because it bypasses the need for surface compatibility. It feels like truth because it reflects back something already known internally. Within that emotional acceleration, boundaries blurred. What might have taken months in a different context unfolded in weeks. There was constant proximity, shared workspaces, overlapping routines. On a cruise ship, isolation from external social networks intensifies internal connection. There are fewer interruptions, fewer competing influences. Relationships develop in a closed environment, which can amplify both genuine intimacy and constructed illusion. When Wayne proposed after only a month, it did not feel as abrupt to Cynthia as it might appear in retrospect. The emotional intensity had already compressed time. The proposal itself was staged in a moment designed to feel private and symbolic. A ring presented not in a public spectacle, but in a quiet space where emotional meaning could dominate perception. The words he used emphasized permanence, exclusivity, and destiny. He spoke as if their meeting was not random, but inevitable. Cynthia accepted not because she had fully evaluated the relationship, but because she had already emotionally committed to the direction it was heading. Shortly after their engagement, Wayne introduced a narrative that would later become central to the unraveling of trust. He told her his children had died in a tragic car accident. The story was delivered with emotional intensity that left little room for immediate skepticism. He described grief in visceral terms, positioning himself as a father devastated by sudden loss. The emotional impact of such a claim is profound. It invites empathy before analysis. It creates a moral response before a logical one. Cynthia responded as someone conditioned by compassion and emotional responsibility. She comforted him. She absorbed his grief as if it were shared. In doing so, she bonded more deeply to him, not realizing that grief, when presented as narrative rather than lived reality, can function as a powerful tool of emotional anchoring. It shifts perception of the other person from potential partner to vulnerable figure in need of protection. That shift is critical in understanding how manipulation operates in relational contexts. Once someone becomes emotionally responsible for another person's pain, questioning that person's honesty feels like betrayal. The engagement quickly transitioned into marriage. The ceremony was small, but emotionally charged. Family attended. There was celebration. Food prepared by loved ones. A sense of communal blessing. Cynthia entered that moment believing she had successfully rebuilt something meaningful from the remnants of her past. She believed she had chosen differently this time, more carefully, more wisely. After marriage, their life appeared stable on the surface. They worked together, shared responsibilities, and built routines that mimic conventional partnership. But beneath that structure, inconsistencies began to accumulate. Wayne's explanations about his military obligations did not align with observable reality. His travel patterns did not match the geography he described. His communication about reserve duties lacked institutional coherence. These details did not immediately disrupt the relationship, but they began to introduce friction between perception and reality. At first, Cynthia resolved these inconsistencies through trust. Trust functions as a stabilizer when information is incomplete. It allows relationships to continue without constant verification. But trust is also vulnerable when repeatedly challenged by contradiction. The first direct disruption came when law enforcement arrived at their workplace. That moment did not just introduce legal consequences. It introduced external validation that something in Wayne's narrative did not align with official records. The presence of sheriff transformed abstract doubt into concrete concern. It forced Cynthia to confront the possibility that her private understanding of her husband was incomplete or incorrect. From that point forward, her identity as a partner became entangled with uncertainty. She was no longer simply experiencing a relationship. She was attempting to reconcile two competing versions of reality. One built on emotional experience, the other built on institutional evidence. And between those two versions, trust began to fracture in ways that could not easily be repaired. The arrest did not begin with violence or chaos. It began with a quiet arrival that carried more weight than any dramatic intrusion could have achieved. A sheriff stepped into the motel lobby as if he already belonged there, as if the space had been waiting for his presence to complete a sentence that had already been written elsewhere. Cynthia remembered the way the air shifted the moment he crossed the threshold. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was precise, like a line being drawn through a life that had until then felt continuous. Wayne was nearby when it happened, and for a brief moment he did not react at all. He simply stood still, as if waiting for clarification that might rewrite the situation into something less consequential. The sheriff's question was direct, stripped of ambiguity. Do you know Wayne Chen? It was not phrased as suspicion. It was phrased as identification, as confirmation, as if the name itself already carried context that did not need to be explained. Cynthia's first instinct was confusion rather than fear. Her mind tried to locate the situation within familiar categories. Misunderstanding, Administrative issue. Clerical error. Something temporary that will resolve itself with explanation. That instinct is common when reality begins to shift faster than emotional processing can follow. The brain searches for the least disruptive interpretation first. But what followed did not support that interpretation. Wayne stepped outside with the officer, and the door closed behind him in a way that felt final even though nothing had yet been decided. Inside the motel office, Cynthia remained standing behind the counter, her hands still positioned as if she had been in the middle of a task that no longer mattered. Customers were present, but no one spoke. The silence that filled the space was not empty. It was observational. People were watching without wanting to appear as if they were watching. When Wayne returned briefly to speak with her, his voice carried a tone that attempted to reduce urgency. He said it had to be a mistake. That word, mistake, became a temporary anchor. It suggested repairability. It suggested misunderstanding. It suggested that reality had simply been misfiled and could be corrected with time. But law enforcement does not typically arrive in that manner for minor administrative errors. Later that day, the explanation expanded, and with it came the first structural collapse of Cynthia's understanding of her husband. Wayne was not only facing a current accusation, he had an outstanding warrant from another jurisdiction. Lewis County in Washington was mentioned, a place Cynthia had not previously associated with their life. The introduction of another state, another legal system, another unresolved past created immediate cognitive strain. It meant that the situation she was witnessing was not isolated. It was connected to something larger that had been operating before she ever met him. The charge itself was forgery, but that word alone does not capture the implications. Forgery suggests deliberate falsification, intentional misrepresentation of identity or documents. It implies a pattern of behavior rather than a single impulsive act. When combined with bail jumping, it paints a picture of avoidance rather than compliance. Someone who does not simply make mistakes, but moves through systems without fully engaging with their consequences. Wayne's explanation arrived quickly after the arrest, and it followed a familiar emotional structure. He did not deny the existence of legal issues entirely. Instead, he reframed them. He described misunderstanding, false accusations, and interpersonal conflict with individuals from his past. The story centered around a former partner who allegedly misrepresented financial dealings and retaliated through legal systems after a breakup. It was a narrative that positioned him as reactive rather than initiatory. Cynthia listened, and in doing so, she entered a psychological space that many people experience when confronted with conflicting versions of someone they love. The mind begins to weigh emotional familiarity against external information. Emotional familiarity is powerful because it is built over time through shared experience, intimacy, and trust. External information, especially when delivered suddenly, lacks that emotional grounding. It can feel abstract, even intrusive. At that stage, Cynthia still leaned toward emotional continuity. The idea that Wayne might be fundamentally dishonest did not yet feel real. Instead, she interpreted the situation as legal complication surrounding someone she knew intimately. That distinction is important because it determines whether new information is integrated as truth or resisted as disruption. Wayne's demeanor reinforced that resistance. He did not present himself as panicked or destabilized. He maintained composure, occasionally frustration, but not collapse. He spoke as someone trying to manage inconvenience rather than existential threat. That behavioral consistency made his explanation feel more believable than the external accusations, because people often equate emotional stability with truthfulness. Shortly after the arrest, financial consequences began to surface in ways that were immediate and disorienting. Cynthia went to the bank expecting routine access to their accounts. Instead, she encountered absence, not restriction, not delay, absence. The money was gone. The accounts that represented security, planning, and future stability were empty. That moment created a second rupture, separate from the legal shock, but equally destabilizing. Financial loss carries a different emotional weight than legal accusation. It is intimate. It affects survival directly. It removes the buffer between crisis and consequence. Standing in the bank, Cynthia was forced to confront not just uncertainty about Wayne's actions, but instability in her physical ability to support her children. When she called her sister afterward, the urgency in her voice reflected a shift from confusion to crisis. She was no longer trying to understand what was happening. She was trying to ensure safety. That distinction marks a transition point in many true crime narratives, where emotional processing gives way to immediate protective action. The next stage of the incident unfolded through fragmented communication with Wayne from jail. Phone calls replaced presence, and those calls were constrained, monitored, and emotionally incomplete. He insisted that he could not speak freely, that surveillance extended even into communication channels. This claim reinforced a sense of external pressure, suggesting that the situation was larger than a simple criminal case. He asked to be brought home so everything could be explained properly. That request introduced emotional tension because it positioned reunion as the key to clarity. It implied that truth was being withheld not because it did not exist, but because circumstances prevented its expression. This is a common narrative structure in manipulation scenarios, where resolution is always deferred to a future moment that never fully arrives. Meanwhile, legal reality advanced independently of personal communication. Bail was set at a figure far beyond what Cynthia and her family could manage alone. The financial burden created dependency on external support, forcing rapid decisions about borrowing and trust. Friends became financial lifelines, and legal defense became something she had to actively participate in despite not fully understanding the charges. When Wayne was released temporarily, his return carried emotional complexity rather than relief. There was a sense of re-entry into a life that no longer felt intact. He spoke of gambling debts, of financial collapse, of desperate decisions made under pressure. The admission that savings had been destroyed through gambling introduced a new dimension to the crisis. It reframed the financial disappearance not as external theft or legal seizure, but as internal erosion over time. This revelation altered Cynthia's perception of their shared past. It meant that instability had not begun with arrest. It had been building silently beneath the surface of their life together. Every financial decision, every period of stability, now became suspect in hindsight. Memory itself began to shift under the weight of new interpretation. As investigators continued their work, another layer emerged involving illicit transportation. Wayne had begun taking flights for individuals who paid him large sums of money to move sealed luggage without inspection. At first, these arrangements may have appeared to him as simple transactions, cash in exchange for flights. No passengers, no questions. But the structure of those arrangements placed him within proximity of criminal networks that operated with deliberate concealment. The discovery of narcotics within his aircraft transformed suspicion into evidence. Large quantities of cocaine were not subtle indicators. They were definitive. They connected his actions to broader trafficking operations that extended beyond individual behavior. From the perspective of law enforcement, this shifted the case from personal misconduct to organized criminal involvement. For Cynthia, each new revelation did not replace the previous one. It layered over it. Legal issues, financial collapse, gambling, drug transportation. Each layer added complexity without removing emotional attachment. This accumulation created psychological fragmentation, where no single explanation could fully dominate perception. The final emotional impact of this phase came not from one event, but from the realization that certainty itself was no longer available. Every attempt to stabilize understanding produced another contradiction. Every explanation created another question. And in that unstable environment, Cynthia was forced to begin reconstructing her understanding of the man she had married, not as a single identity, but as a collection of fragmented truths that no longer aligned into a coherent whole. The call from the district attorney did not feel real at first. It arrived on an ordinary day, at an ordinary moment, in a place that carried no warning of what was about to be spoken. Cynthia remembered the setting with strange clarity, precisely because of its normality. She was at a car repair shop, waiting in a space filled with the smell of oil, rubber, and overheated metal. The kind of place where time slows down, where people scroll through phones or stare at walls while their vehicles are serviced. Nothing about that environment suggested that life was about to fracture. When the phone rang, she saw an unfamiliar Georgia area code. Her first assumption was simple and practical. Wayne was traveling. He flew often. It was not unusual for him to be in different states, sometimes for work, sometimes for reasons she did not fully understand but had learned not to question too deeply. She answered without hesitation, expecting his voice on the other end. Instead, she heard a man identify himself as a district attorney. The tone was calm, controlled, professional. That calmness made the content even more disorienting. He did not begin with small talk or gradual explanation. He moved directly into a statement that disrupted any sense of normal expectation. He told her that her family had been under surveillance for some time, not casually observed, but actively monitored. The phrasing suggested duration, attention, and seriousness that immediately pulled the ground out from under her understanding of her own life. Cynthia did not respond immediately with fear. Her first reaction was confusion, so deep it bordered on disbelief. She asked what he meant, asking for clarification, as if misunderstanding were the most likely explanation. But the voice on the other end did not soften. Instead, it continued with increasing gravity. He told her she needed to be careful. He told her she needed to consider disappearing. Then the call ended abruptly. There was no transition, no explanation, no opportunity for follow-up questions. The line simply went dead, leaving silence that felt heavier than the conversation itself. For several seconds, Cynthia remained standing in the repair shop, phone still pressed her ear, as if waiting for the connection to return. Around her, life continued normally. Mechanics moved through the garage. Radios played faintly in the background. Someone laughed in a distant corner, but none of it registered properly. It felt as if she had been separated from the environment without physically moving. When she finally processed the words she had heard, they did not arrange themselves into coherent meaning. Surveillance, danger, disappear. These were not words that belonged in her daily life. They belonged in movies, in distant news stories, in other people's experiences, not hers. She called Wayne immediately, but the response she received did not restore clarity. Instead, it introduced more uncertainty. He confirmed that he was in custody, but his explanation was fragmented, constrained, and filled with warnings about being monitored. He told her he could not speak freely. He insisted that she needed to act cautiously. He urged her to trust him, but trust was no longer something that could operate without evidence. When she went to the bank shortly afterward, she expected at least one stable point of reference. Money, after all, is supposed to be concrete. It exists in numbers, in accounts, in records. It is not supposed to disappear without explanation. But when she attempted to access their funds, the account showed nothing. No partial balance. No temporary restriction. Just absence. That moment created a second rupture, different from the legal shock, but equally destabilizing. If the phone call had introduced fear, the bank account introduced reality. Fear can be questioned. Numbers are harder to argue with. She called her sister immediately after leaving the bank. Her voice was no longer simply confused. It carried urgency, fragmentation, and disbelief trying to organize itself into action. She did not yet have a plan, but she understood instinctively that she could not remain where she was. Within hours, she was relocated to a gated community where her sister lived. The physical environment changed, but the emotional state did not stabilize. Safety in structure does not immediately translate to safety in perception. Even behind closed gates, Cynthia felt exposed, as if the boundaries of her world had already been breached and could not be restored simply by changing location. Family gathered quickly. Conversations overlapped. Questions were asked, repeated, rephrased. Information arrived in fragments, each piece increasing confusion rather than reducing it. There was no single narrative that explained everything. Instead, there were multiple partial accounts competing for coherence. Cynthia sat through these conversations holding her children, trying to maintain physical calm while internally struggling to process what had happened. The idea that Wayne had been arrested was now confirmed. But the reason, the scale, and the implications were still unfolding. When she finally spoke to Wayne again from jail, the emotional dynamic had shifted. The authority of physical presence was gone. What remained was voice, constrained by institutional monitoring. He repeated that he could not speak freely. He insisted that surveillance extended even into communication. This claim introduced a new layer of paranoia into the situation, whether justified or not, because it suggested that even conversations were not private. He asked her to bring him home. That request carried emotional weight because it implied that physical proximity was the key to truth, that once reunited, explanations would become clear. But it also created dependency, positioning resolution as something conditional rather than immediate. Meanwhile, legal processes continued independently of emotional needs. Bail was set at an amount that exceeded their available resources. That number was not just financial. It was symbolic. It represented the severity with which authorities viewed the situation. It also forced immediate decisions about borrowing, trust, and survival. Friends and family became financial intermediaries in a situation they did not fully understand. Money was raised under pressure, with incomplete information, driven by urgency rather than certainty. This created a secondary emotional burden, because each financial contribution carried implicit trust in Cynthia's judgment, even as her own certainty was collapsing. When Wayne was released temporarily, his return did not restore stability. Instead, it introduced a different kind of tension. He spoke about gambling losses, describing financial decisions that had drained their resources over time. This explanation reframed their entire financial history. What had once seemed like normal fluctuations in spending or income now appeared as signs of concealed instability. Cynthia began mentally revisiting years of shared life, searching for patterns she had not previously recognized. Moments when money felt tight without explanation. Decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but now carried hidden implications. The realization that financial collapse had not been sudden, but gradual, was particularly disorienting. It meant that instability had been present even during periods that felt secure. At the same time, investigators were building a parallel narrative that extended beyond finances. Flight records showed irregular patterns. Aircraft were used in ways that deviated from standard procedure. Cargo was transported without clear documentation. Routes were altered mid-flight. These were not isolated anomalies. They formed a pattern that suggested deliberate behavior rather than accidental oversight. When narcotics were discovered within suitcases transported on one of Wayne's flights, the case crossed a threshold. What had been uncertainty became evidence. Large quantities of cocaine eliminated ambiguity. From the perspective of law enforcement, this was no longer a matter of explanation. It was a matter of involvement. Cynthia was forced to absorb this information without the benefit of gradual understanding. Each revelation arrived fully formed, without transition. Gambling, financial collapse, illegal flights, drug trafficking. Each layer added complexity, without removing emotional attachment. The most difficult aspect was not any single accusation, but the accumulation itself. There was no longer a single explanation that could reconcile all available information. Every attempt to construct coherence produced contradiction. Every answer generated another question. By the end of this phase, Cynthia found herself standing in a reality that no longer matched any version of her past understanding. The life she believed she'd been living remained visible in memory, but it no longer aligned with evidence emerging in the present. And between those two versions of reality, she was left suspended, forced to navigate uncertainty without a stable foundation to anchor her understanding.